The moment Daniel Hayes saw Olivia Turner's face freeze on her porch that autumn afternoon, he knew something had shattered. Harper's innocent goodbye kiss on his cheek had been nothing, a friendly gesture from an old college friend. But to Olivia, watching from her kitchen window, it had been everything. The warmth that had been slowly building between them over months of shared coffee, fixed faucets, and stolen glances evaporated in an instant. Her door slammed, the curtains closed, and Daniel stood there, heart sinking, realizing he might have just lost something he hadn't even known he wanted until it was gone. Before we dive into this story, if you're enjoying it so far, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Daniel Hayes had learned early that life didn't hand out second chances like party favors. At 32, he'd already lived through enough plot twists to fill someone else's entire existence. A shotgun wedding at 23, a baby at 24, a divorce at 25, and full custody of Mason by 26. 6 years of single fatherhood had taught him that stability wasn't something you stumbled into. It was something you built, brick by careful brick, in the quiet hours between Mason's bedtime and your own exhaustion. Their house sat at the end of Maple Crest Drive, a modest two-bedroom ranch with blue siding that needed repainting and a porch that creaked in all the right places. The kind of house that didn't turn heads, but held hearts. Inside, Daniel had created a world that revolved around predictability. Monday meant spaghetti and math homework. Tuesday was taco night and reading time. Wednesday through Friday followed their own rhythms, each day a note in a carefully composed symphony designed to give Mason something Daniel himself had never had: security. The kitchen was the heart of it all. Subway tiles Daniel had installed himself. Open shelving holding mismatched mugs and Mason's crooked pottery from school. A window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard where a tire swing hung from the old oak tree. On any given evening, you'd find flour dusting the counters, something baking in the oven, and indie folk music drifting from the Bluetooth speaker, the Lumineers, Gregory Alan Isakov, Iron and Wine. Music that felt like flannel shirts and comfortable silence. Mason was 7 now, all elbows and endless questions, with Daniel's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. He was the kind of kid who narrated his own life while playing, who made friends with every dog in the neighborhood, who still believed his dad could fix absolutely anything. And Daniel worked hard to maintain that illusion, even when his own hand shook with uncertainty. "Dad, why do we always have banana bread on Thursdays?" Mason had asked one evening, perched on the kitchen counter, while Daniel mixed batter. "Because your grandma used to make it every Thursday," Daniel said, measuring vanilla. "And her mom before that. Some traditions are worth keeping. Even if grandma lives far away. Especially then, it's like she's here with us, in a way." Mason had nodded solemnly, accepting this logic the way children do, with complete faith in their father's wisdom. Daniel had turned away, swallowing against the familiar ache. His mother did live far away, clear across the country in Florida, where she'd moved after the divorce to start fresh. She sent cards on Mason's birthday and called every few weeks, but the distance between them wasn't just geographical. It was the distance between the son she'd expected him to be and the reality of who he'd become. A single father, a handyman, a man who'd chosen his kid over graduate school, stability over adventure, routine over romance. Next door in a house almost identical to his own, but with better landscaping and a porch that looked like something from a gardening magazine, lived Olivia Turner. Daniel had noticed her the day she moved in, 2 years ago this past spring. How could he not? She'd worn paint-stained overalls and had been hauling boxes twice her size, refusing help from the movers with a polite stubbornness that made him smile. Her hair had been pulled back in a messy bun, dark strands escaping around a face that was pretty in an understated way, like she didn't know it or didn't care. Hazel eyes that seemed to catalog everything, a careful way of moving, as if she took up as little space as possible. "New neighbor," Mason had observed from their front window, age 5 and already interested in the comings and goings of Maple Crest Drive. "Looks like it," Daniel had agreed. "Should we bring her cookies?" "Maybe give her a day to settle in first, buddy." But Mason, with the fearlessness of children, had marched over the very next morning with a plate of Daniel's chocolate chip cookies and a hand-drawn welcome card. Daniel had followed, mortified and charmed in equal measure, to find Olivia answering the door in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by unpacked boxes. "We're your neighbors," Mason had announced. "I'm Mason, and this is my dad, Daniel. We made you cookies, but Dad made them, not me, because I'm not allowed to use the oven yet." Olivia had blinked, clearly overwhelmed, but then something had softened in her expression. "That's very kind of you both. I'm Olivia." "Do you have any kids?" Mason had asked with characteristic bluntness. "Mason," Daniel had warned gently. "It's okay," Olivia had said, crouching to Mason's level. "I don't, but I teach kids. 2nd grade at Riverside Elementary." "I'm in 1st grade. Maybe you'll be my teacher next year." And just like that, Mason had decided they were friends. Daniel had offered to help with anything she needed, moving furniture, figuring out the quirks of these old houses, whatever. She'd declined politely. But 2 weeks later, when her kitchen faucet had started spraying water like a broken fire hydrant, she'd knocked on their door with an apologetic smile and asked if Daniel knew anything about plumbing. He'd fixed it in 20 minutes, refusing payment, and she'd insisted on making them dinner as thanks. Pasta primavera with fresh bread, eaten at her small dining table while Mason chattered about his day and Olivia listened with the patient attention of someone who genuinely loved children. It had been nice, comfortable. The first time in years Daniel had shared a meal with a woman that didn't feel like a setup or an obligation or a mistake waiting to happen. After that, it had become a pattern. Something broke. Daniel fixed it. Olivia baked something delicious. Daniel and Mason enjoyed it. The fence between their yards might as well have had a revolving door. She brought over lemon bars and apple pie. He repaired her garbage disposal and replaced her porch light. Mason started doing his homework at her kitchen table on the days Daniel ran late with work. She taught him watercolor techniques and how to make paper snowflakes that actually looked like snowflakes. It was neighborly, friendly, uncomplicated. Except it wasn't, not really, not anymore. Daniel couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift had happened. Maybe it was the evening he'd found her sitting on her porch steps in the rain, just sitting there getting soaked, and he'd gone over with an umbrella to find tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. She told him it was the anniversary of her mother's death, 10 years gone, and Daniel had sat beside her in the rain without saying a word, just being there, until she was ready to go inside. Or maybe it was the Saturday morning she'd shown up with coffee and pastries because she knew Daniel had been up until 3 a.m. finishing a bathroom renovation for a client. She'd entertained Mason with art projects while Daniel caught a few hours of sleep on the couch, and he'd woken to the sound of their laughter and felt something shift in his chest. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small moments. The way she smiled when she saw him. The comfortable silences that stretched between them while they worked in her garden, planting bulbs for spring. The inside jokes about their cantankerous neighbor 3 houses down. The way Mason had started calling her Miss Olivia in that sweet way kids did when they loved someone. The way Daniel had started thinking about her at odd hours, wondering what she was doing, hoping she'd knock on the door, finding excuses to fix things in her house that weren't even broken. He hadn't acted on it, hadn't even acknowledged it to himself, not really, because Daniel Hayes didn't do complicated. He didn't do romance or risk or anything that might destabilize the careful world he'd built for his son. Mason came first. Mason would always come first, and that meant keeping his life simple, his relationships clear-cut, his heart safely locked away. Olivia seemed to operate under similar rules. She was friendly but guarded, warm but distant. She talked about her students, her art, her garden, but rarely about herself. Daniel knew she'd grown up in Portland, that she'd lost her mother young, that she'd moved to Idaho for a fresh start 3 years ago. But the details remained hazy, protected by invisible walls she'd built as carefully as he'd built his own. They were 2 people who'd learned to be cautious, 2 people who'd been hurt enough to know better than to reach for something fragile, which was why the whole thing with Harper had felt like such a cruel joke. Harper Collins had been part of Daniel's life since freshman year of college, back when he'd been a different person entirely. Young, optimistic, planning to major in architecture and design buildings that would change skylines. They'd met in an art history elective, bonded over their shared love of Frank Lloyd Wright and coffee that was more sugar than caffeine, and had remained friends even after Daniel's life took its sharp left turn into fatherhood and responsibility. Harper had gone on to become exactly what she'd always planned to be. A successful architect working for a firm in Seattle, designing the kind of buildings Daniel used to dream about. She traveled, she thrived, she lived the life he might have lived if different choices had been made. But she'd never judged him for his path, never made him feel small for choosing different. She sent Mason birthday presents, called on holidays, and visited once or twice a year when work brought her through Idaho. This particular visit had been unplanned. Harper had a consultation with a potential client in Boise and decided to drive the extra hour to see Daniel and Mason. She'd shown up on a Thursday afternoon in early October when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air held that perfect autumn crispness. "Uncle Harper!" Mason had shrieked, launching himself off the porch before Daniel could even register that her car was in the driveway. Harper caught him with practiced ease, spinning him around. "Hey, kiddo, look at you. You've grown like a foot since June." 3 inches, Daniel corrected from the doorway, grinning. But who's counting? She'd set Mason down and pulled Daniel into a hug, the comfortable embrace of old friends who'd seen each other through college hangovers and life crises alike. "You look good, Hayes. Domestic life suits you." "You're a terrible liar, Collins. I look exhausted." "Exhausted but happy. That's what matters." They'd spent the afternoon catching up while Mason showed Harper his Lego creations and artwork. She'd brought stories from the big city, tales of difficult clients and innovative designs. Daniel had shared his own stories, the small triumphs and quiet frustrations of life in their little town. They'd ordered pizza for dinner, laughed over old college memories, and fallen into the easy rhythm of friendship that didn't require constant maintenance. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd finished your degree?" Harper had asked later, after Mason had gone to bed and they were sitting on the porch with beers. Daniel had shrugged. "Sometimes, but not with regret, if that's what you're asking. This is my life. Mason is my life. I'm good with that." "I know you are. I just wonder if you're too good with it, you know? Like, when was the last time you went on a date, Daniel?" "I date? When?" "I went out with Sarah from the hardware store last spring. One dinner 8 months ago doesn't count." "I'm busy, Harper, and I'm picky. Sue me." She'd given him a long look, the kind that saw too much. "You're scared." "I'm cautious. There's a difference." "Is there?" Before he could answer, movement from the neighboring porch had caught his eye. Olivia had been sitting outside, reading in the glow of her porch light. She'd looked up at the sound of their voices, and Daniel had raised his hand in greeting. She'd waved back, but something in her expression had seemed off, distant. "Who's that?" Harper had asked. "Olivia, my neighbor. Pretty. She's a friend." "Uh-huh." Harper's grin had been knowing. "Just a friend?" "Yes, Harper, just a friend." But even as he'd said it, he'd felt the lie in his bones. The next morning, Harper had to leave early for her meeting in Boise. Daniel and Mason had walked her out to her car, still in their pajamas, the morning air sharp and clear. "Thanks for visiting," Daniel had said. "It's always good to see you." "Likewise." "Don't be a stranger, okay? And seriously, think about what I said. You deserve to be happy, Daniel, not just content. Actually happy." She'd hugged him goodbye then, standing on his porch in full view of the quiet street. She'd kissed his cheek. A friendly gesture. Nothing more. The kind of thing they'd done 100 times before. Except this time, when Daniel had glanced toward Olivia's house, he'd seen her standing at her kitchen window, watching. And the expression on her face, shock, hurt, something that looked almost like betrayal, had made his stomach drop. Their eyes had met for just a second. Then she'd turned away, disappearing into the depths of her house. "Everything okay?" Harper had asked, noticing his sudden tension. "Yeah," Daniel had lied. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. And as Harper's car disappeared down the street and Mason ran inside to get ready for school, Daniel had stood on his porch, staring at Olivia's closed door, knowing that something fundamental had just shifted. The change was immediate and absolute. That afternoon, when Daniel got home from dropping Mason at school and running errands, he'd knocked on Olivia's door with a cracked tile he'd found at the hardware store. A perfect match for the one that had broken in her bathroom last week. He'd planned to install it that evening. She'd answered, but her warmth had evaporated. Her smile was polite, nothing more. "Thanks, but I'll handle it myself." It'll take 10 minutes. I don't mind. I appreciate it, but I'd prefer to do it on my own. The door had closed, not slammed. Somehow that was worse. Daniel had stood there, confused and concerned, the tile growing heavy in his hands. He'd wanted to knock again to ask what was wrong, but some instinct had stopped him. She wanted space. He'd give her space. But the space stretched on. Days passed, a week. The casual rhythm of their lives, coffee on the porch, Mason doing homework at her table, shared meals and easy conversation, ground to a halt. Olivia's curtains stayed drawn. She left for work early and came home late. When Daniel saw her in passing, she was cordial but distant, like they were strangers who happened to share a property line. Mason noticed. Of course he noticed. "Is Miss Olivia mad at us?" he'd asked on Tuesday evening, staring out the window at her dark house. "No, buddy. I think she's just busy. She's never too busy for us." Daniel hadn't had an answer for that, because Mason was right. Olivia had never been too busy. She'd made time, always, even during the chaos of parent-teacher conferences and art show preparations. She'd been the one constant adult presence in Mason's life besides Daniel himself, and now she was gone, as suddenly as if she'd moved away. Daniel replayed that morning with Harper obsessively, trying to understand what had triggered such a dramatic shift. The only thing that stood out was the moment Olivia had seen them together, the kiss, her face. But that didn't make sense. Harper was clearly just a friend. There had been nothing romantic about the gesture, unless Olivia had thought there was. The realization hit him like cold water. She'd seen a woman kissing him goodbye, staying overnight, sharing beers on the porch. And she'd made assumptions. Wrong assumptions, but understandable ones. The question was, why did those assumptions bother her so much? And the answer, the one that made his heart race and his hands unsteady, was becoming harder to ignore. By Thursday evening, Daniel had had enough of the silence. He'd spent the afternoon baking apple cinnamon muffins, using his grandmother's recipe, the one that had never failed to make people smile. It was a peace offering, an opening, a bridge across whatever chasm had opened between them. Mason sat at the kitchen table, doing homework and stealing glances at the cooling muffins. "Can I have one?" he'd asked hopefully. "These are for Miss Olivia. Is she still busy?" "I'm going to find out." Daniel had arranged 6 muffins on a plate, covered them with foil, and walked next door with his heart pounding harder than any handyman job had ever warranted. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and orange. Olivia's porch flowers, petunias and marigolds that shouldn't still be blooming in October but somehow were, swayed in the evening breeze. He'd knocked, waited, almost given up. Then the door had opened. Olivia stood there in jeans and a soft gray sweater, hair down around her shoulders, feet bare. She looked tired, guarded, beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. "Hi," Daniel had said, suddenly feeling like a teenager instead of a 32-year-old father. "Hi." Her voice was carefully neutral. "I made muffins, apple cinnamon. Thought you might like some." She'd looked at the plate, then at him, and something flickered in her expression, something painful. "That's kind of you, but I'm sure your girlfriend would prefer you save them for her." The words had hung there, sharp and deliberate. Daniel had blinked, processing. "My what?" "The woman who stayed over last week. I'm sure she'd appreciate them more than I would." Understanding had crashed over him. "Harper?" "I don't know her name." "Harper is not my girlfriend." Olivia's jaw had tightened. "It's really none of my business." "No, wait." Daniel had stepped forward without thinking, and Olivia had stepped back instinctively, maintaining distance. The movement had stung. "Harper is an old friend from college. She was visiting because she had work in Boise. There's nothing romantic between us. There never has been." "You don't owe me an explanation, Daniel." "Maybe not, but I'm giving you one anyway, because I don't understand why you've been avoiding me for a week over a misunderstanding." Her composure had cracked then, just slightly. Her hands had gripped the doorframe. "I haven't been avoiding you." "Olivia?" "Fine. Maybe I have. But like I said, it's none of my business who you spend time with, or who you—" She'd stopped, pressing her lips together. "Who I what?" "Nothing." "Say it." The silence had stretched, taut as a wire. Then, quietly, she'd said, "Who you kiss? Who you let into your life? It's not my business, and I had no right to be upset." But you were upset. She'd looked away out at the darkening street. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I'm an idiot, Olivia. Because I convinced myself that this," she gestured vaguely between them, "whatever this is, meant something. And then I saw you with her, and I realized I'd built something up in my head that wasn't real, that I was reading into things that weren't there. And I felt stupid and embarrassed, and I thought the best thing to do was just create some distance before I made it worse." Daniel's heart had been hammering now, everything suddenly sharp and clear. What if you weren't reading into things? Her eyes had snapped back to his. What? What if you weren't wrong? What if this, he'd echoed her earlier gesture, does mean something? "Daniel, I care about you, Olivia, not as a neighbor, not just as a friend." The words had tumbled out, months of careful restraint crumbling. "I look forward to seeing you every day. I make excuses to fix things in your house that aren't broken. I think about you when I'm falling asleep and when I'm waking up. Mason talks about you constantly because you've become part of our lives in a way that matters. And I've been too scared to acknowledge any of it because I don't do complicated and I don't take risks, especially not with Mason's stability at stake. But this past week, not having you around, it's been hard," she'd finish softly. "Yeah, really hard." Olivia had been staring at him, eyes wide, something vulnerable and uncertain in her expression. "Harper really is just a friend? I swear. And you care about me? More than I probably should." She'd laughed then, a shaky sound that was almost a sob. "I've been so stupid." "You haven't." "I got jealous, Daniel. I saw another woman with you, and I got jealous like some possessive—" "I'm glad." That had stopped her. "What?" "I'm glad you got jealous, because it means I'm not alone in feeling this way. In wanting—" He'd paused, searching for the right words. "In wanting more than just borrowed sugar and fixed faucets." The air between them had felt electric, charged with possibilities that terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Olivia had looked at the muffins still in his hands, then back at his face. "I don't know how to do this," she'd admitted. I'm not good at letting people in. Neither am I. I come with baggage. So do I. I have a 7-year-old son who comes first always, who needs stability and consistency and a father who doesn't screw up his life with impulsive decisions. This feels impulsive. Does it? Because I've been thinking about you for months, Olivia. This isn't impulsive. This is just finally honest." She'd reached out then, slowly, and taken the plate of muffins from his hands, set them on the small table just inside her door. When she'd looked at him again, some of the guardedness had melted away. "I've been thinking about you too," she'd said quietly. "I moved here to get away from complications and disappointments. I told myself I'd focus on my job, my art, my independence. I wouldn't need anyone or depend on anyone. And then you moved in next door with your kind eyes and your terrible jokes and your perfect son, and you fixed my sink and ate my pie. And somewhere along the way, I started depending on you without even realizing it. And that scared me, the idea of needing someone again, of being vulnerable. And then you saw Harper. And I panicked because I realized how much I'd already let you in and how much it would hurt to lose that." Daniel had felt something unlock in his chest. "You're not going to lose it. You can't promise that." "No?" he'd agreed. "But I can promise I'm not going anywhere. I can promise that whatever this is, we figure it out together, slowly, carefully. Because I'm terrified too, Olivia. I'm terrified of screwing this up, of hurting you, of confusing Mason, of all of it. But I'm more terrified of letting fear stop me from what?" He'd met her eyes, steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "From seeing where this goes." The porch light had cast shadows across her face, but her eyes had been clear, certain. "I'd like that." "Yeah? Yeah?" They'd stood there, two cautious people on the edge of something neither fully understood, the autumn evening wrapping around them. Daniel had wanted to kiss her, wanted it so badly his hands had trembled with the restraint of not reaching for her. But this wasn't the moment. Not yet. This was the beginning of something, and beginnings required patience. Have dinner with us tomorrow, he'd said instead. Me and Mason, nothing fancy, just spend time with us, like you used to. Olivia had smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. I'd love that. 7 o'clock? I'll bring dessert. You don't have to. I want to. Daniel had nodded, stepping back toward the porch steps. Okay, 7 o'clock. Daniel? He'd turned back. Thank you for the muffins and for being honest. Thank you for being brave enough to tell me the truth. She'd watched him walk back to his own house, and when Daniel had glanced back from his porch, she'd still been there, framed in her doorway, holding his muffins and smiling in the fading light. Inside, Mason had looked up from his homework with hope written across his young face. Is Miss Olivia coming over? Tomorrow for dinner. Is she not busy anymore? Daniel had ruffled his son's hair, feeling lighter than he had in days. No, buddy, she's not busy anymore. That night, after Mason had gone to bed, Daniel had sat alone in his kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the shared fence between his yard and Olivia's, trying to process everything that had shifted in the space of one conversation. He'd admitted feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself. She'd confessed to jealousy, to wanting more. They'd agreed to explore whatever this was between them. It should have felt like relief, and it did. But it also felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would either let him fly or send him plummeting. Daniel had been in love before, exactly once. Ashley, Mason's mother, who he'd met at a party junior year and married 6 months later when 2 pink lines had changed everything. They'd been young and unprepared and convinced that love would be enough to overcome practical problems like money and maturity and the fact that they'd barely known each other. It hadn't been enough. Not even close. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years. The divorce had been bitter and complicated, made worse by Ashley's resentment at having to be a mother when she'd barely stopped being a daughter herself. She'd fought for custody initially, more out of spite than desire, but had eventually relinquished it when the reality of single parenthood proved too demanding for her lifestyle. Now she lived in California with a new husband and a career in marketing. She sent child support checks and birthday cards. She saw Mason twice a year during court-mandated visits. She'd moved on, built a new life, and Daniel tried not to hold it against her. Tried to remember that not everyone was built for the sacrifices parenthood required. But the experience had left scars. It had taught him that love, the passionate, impulsive kind, could be dangerous. That feelings could blind you to incompatibilities. That jumping into relationships without careful thought could have consequences that affected more than just yourself. So he'd been careful. Dated occasionally, never seriously, kept his heart locked down, focused on being the kind of father Mason deserved instead of the kind of man who chased romance. And it had worked. For years, it had worked. Until Olivia. She was different from Ashley in every conceivable way. Where Ashley had been impulsive and dramatic, Olivia was thoughtful and measured. Where Ashley had demanded attention, Olivia offered quiet presence. Where Ashley had run from responsibility, Olivia embraced it, teaching children, tending her garden, building a life of careful independence. She was different, but that didn't mean it would work. That didn't mean he wouldn't hurt her or she wouldn't hurt him. That didn't mean Mason wouldn't get caught in the fallout if things went wrong. These were the thoughts that had kept Daniel up late, long after his tea had gone cold. The next evening, Olivia had shown up at 7 o'clock sharp with a homemade apple crisp and a bouquet of autumn flowers for Mason. She'd worn a simple blue dress and a nervous smile, and Mason had hugged her like she'd been gone for months instead of just a week. I missed you, Miss Olivia. I missed you too, sweetheart. Dinner had been lasagna, one of Daniel's reliable dishes, with salad and garlic bread. They'd eaten at the small kitchen table, the three of them, and the conversation had flowed as easily as it always had. Mason had dominated the discussion with stories about school and updates on his latest obsessions, dinosaurs this week, apparently. And Olivia had listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Mason light up with importance. Daniel had watched them together and felt something settle in his chest. This was what he'd been afraid of losing. Not just Olivia's presence in his own life, but her place in Mason's world. His son had already lost one mother figure who'd chosen not to stay. Daniel couldn't let him lose another, which meant whatever happened between him and Olivia had to be handled with extreme care. After dinner, Mason had convinced Olivia to help him with an art project, making paper jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween, which was just a couple weeks away. They'd spread supplies across the living room floor while Daniel cleaned up the kitchen, the sound of their laughter drifting through the house like music. "No, you fold it like this," Olivia had been explaining. "See? Then when you cut it, it makes a pattern." "Whoa, that's so cool! Can you teach me how to make snowflakes too?" "Absolutely. But let's finish the pumpkins first." Daniel had leaned against the kitchen door frame, dish towel in hand, watching them. Olivia had glanced up and caught him staring. Their eyes had held for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, before she'd smiled and turned back to Mason's project. Later, after Mason's bedtime, they'd sat on Daniel's porch with glasses of wine, something they'd never done before, another small shift in the landscape of their relationship. "He really missed you," Daniel had said. "I know I already told you that, but he asked about you every day." "I missed him too. I didn't realize how much he'd become part of my daily routine until suddenly he wasn't there." "Is that the only reason you missed coming over?" She'd looked at him over the rim of her wine glass, a small smile playing at her lips. "Fishing for compliments, Hayes?" "Maybe." "I missed you too. Quite a lot, actually." "Good, because I'm still not entirely sure I didn't dream that whole conversation yesterday." "You didn't." She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. "Daniel, I meant what I said, about wanting to see where this goes, but I need you to understand something." "Okay, I'm not good at this. At relationships, at being vulnerable, at needing people. My mom died when I was 16, and my dad, he dealt with it by disappearing into work. I basically raised myself through high school and college. I learned to be independent because I had to be. And then after college, I was with someone for 3 years. Someone I thought I'd marry." She'd stopped, staring out at the dark street. "What happened?" Daniel had asked gently. "He cheated. Multiple times, apparently. I was the last to know. When I finally found out, I felt like such an idiot, like I'd been so focused on building this perfect future that I'd missed all the signs that he was building one without me." She'd taken a breath. "So I left Portland, started over here, told myself I was done depending on anyone, done getting hurt, and I've been doing fine with that, until you got saddled with terrible neighbors." She'd laughed despite herself. "Something like that." "For what it's worth," Daniel had said, "I'm not him. I don't cheat. I don't play games. And if this goes somewhere, I'm all in. That's how I'm built. But I'm also scared as hell because I have Mason to think about. And if we do this and it doesn't work, he gets hurt." "Yeah. So we're both terrified." "Seems like it." Olivia had set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. "What if we make a deal?" "What kind of deal?" "We take this slow, really slow. We don't tell Mason anything changes unless we're sure. We protect him first, always. And we're honest with each other about how we're feeling, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. No assumptions, no mind reading, just honesty." Daniel had extended his hand, formal and a little silly. "Deal." She'd shaken it, her hand warm in his. "Deal." They'd sat there on the porch for another hour, talking about nothing and everything. Childhood memories, dreams they'd given up, dreams they still held. The conversation had felt easy and profound all at once, the kind of talk that happens when two people stop performing and start revealing. When Olivia had finally stood to leave, Daniel had walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming tonight," he'd said. "Thank you for inviting me back." "Same time next week?" "I'd like that." They'd hovered there in his doorway, close enough to touch, but not touching, the air between them charged with possibility and restraint. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Olivia." He'd watched her cross the dark yard to her own porch, waiting until she was safely inside before closing his door. And for the first time in a week, he'd gone to bed feeling like maybe, just maybe, this terrifying leap might actually be worth taking. The following weeks had fallen into a new rhythm. Olivia came to dinner twice a week. She and Daniel texted throughout the day. Small things, funny observations, shared articles. She brought flowers. He fixed things that broke. Mason remained blissfully unaware that anything had shifted between the adults in his life, seeing only the return of his beloved Miss Olivia. They didn't tell him, not yet. That was the deal. But Daniel felt the change in every interaction, the way Olivia's hand would brush his when passing dishes, the looks they'd exchange over Mason's head when he said something adorably ridiculous. The moments on the porch after dinner, sitting closer each time, talking until the stars came out. Halloween came. They took Mason trick-or-treating together, Olivia dressed as a witch and Daniel as a reluctant werewolf at Mason's insistence. They walked the neighborhood streets, collecting candy and compliments on Mason's dinosaur costume, and Daniel thought about how natural this felt, the three of them together, like a unit, like a family. The thought should have terrified him, and it did, a little, but mostly it felt right. November arrived with frost on the windows and early darkness. The trees stood bare against gray skies. Daniel's work slowed as it always did before winter, giving him more time at home, more time with Olivia. They fell into an easy domesticity. She'd come over in the mornings before work, sharing coffee while Mason got ready for school. They'd cook together in the evenings, moving around Daniel's small kitchen in an unconscious choreography. She'd help Mason with homework while Daniel did dishes. They'd put Mason to bed together sometimes, reading him stories and then retreat to the porch or the living room, talking about their days. It was slow, like they'd promised, careful, but it was also deepening, roots growing beneath the surface. One evening in mid-November, after Mason had gone to bed, they'd been sitting on the couch, closer than they'd sat before. Olivia's legs tucked beneath her, Daniel's arms stretched along the back of the cushions behind her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia had said. "Always." "What are we doing here?" Daniel's heart had kicked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've been dancing around this for weeks now, having dinner, spending time together, acting like a couple but not actually being one. At what point do we stop being careful and start being something?" He'd considered the question seriously. "What do you want us to be?" "I don't know. I just know that I think about you constantly, that I plan my days around seeing you, that when something good happens, you're the first person I want to tell, and when something hard happens, you're the first person I want to talk to." That sounds like more than friendship. It does, doesn't it? Daniel had shifted to face her more fully. "I want to be with you, Olivia, not just as neighbors or friends. I want more, but I need to know you're sure that this isn't just convenience or loneliness or—" She'd leaned forward and kissed him. It had been brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but it had stopped Daniel's heart in his chest. When she'd pulled back, her eyes had been certain. "Does that answer your question?" He'd cupped her face in his hands, thumb brushing her cheek. Getting there. The second kiss had been longer, deeper, the kind of kiss that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, of two careful people deciding to be reckless just for a moment. When they'd finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Olivia had whispered, "I'm sure." "Me too." "So what now?" Daniel had smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "Now we stop dancing around it. Now we actually do this." "What about Mason?" "We tell him, when the time is right, but there's no rush. Let's just be together. See how it feels." "It feels good." "Yeah, it really does." They'd spent the rest of that evening on the couch, talking and kissing in equal measure, years of walls coming down in the span of hours. When Olivia had finally gone home well past midnight, Daniel had felt lighter than he had in years. Terrified, yes, but lighter. Because love, real love, the kind worth having, was always terrifying. It required trust and vulnerability and the courage to believe that maybe, just maybe, it would work out this time. And as Daniel had locked his door and checked on his sleeping son and gotten ready for bed, he'd found himself believing, just a little, just enough. The kiss that had changed everything had been Harper's, but the kiss that mattered, the one that had sealed something fragile and new and hopeful, had been Olivia's, and Daniel couldn't wait to see what came next. The truth was, Daniel had forgotten what it felt like to want someone this way. Not the desperate, frantic wanting of his early 20s when hormones had driven most of his decisions. This was different. This was the wanting that came with knowing exactly what you stood to lose and choosing to reach anyway. The first week after that kiss on the couch passed in a haze of normalcy, punctuated by moments of breathtaking intimacy. They maintained their routines, dinners, coffee, helping Mason with homework, but now there were stolen kisses in the kitchen when Mason wasn't looking, hands that lingered when passing dishes, glances that held promises for later when they were alone. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "You're smiling at your phone, so," Mason observed one morning at breakfast, peering at his father with the suspicious wisdom of a 7-year-old. "Are you texting Miss Olivia?" Daniel had looked up, caught. "Maybe." "You text her a lot now." "We're friends. Friends text." "You never smiled at your phone before when you texted Uncle Mike or Grandma." Out of the mouths of babes, Daniel had set down his phone, giving his son his full attention. "You're right. Miss Olivia and I are close friends." "Like best friends?" "Something like that." Mason had considered this while chewing his cereal. "I like when she comes over. It feels like we're a real family." The words had hit Daniel square in the chest. "Buddy, we are a real family. You and me." "I know, but it's nice having 3 people instead of 2. It's less lonely." Daniel had pulled his son into a hug, throat tight. He'd thought he'd been doing everything right, being both parents, filling all the gaps, making sure Mason never felt the absence of his mother. But kids were perceptive. They noticed the spaces even when you tried to cover them. "I'm glad you like having her around," Daniel had said carefully. "But you know she has her own house, her own life. She won't always be here." "Why not?" "Because that's not how it works." "But what if she wanted to be here all the time? What if she was your girlfriend?" Daniel had pulled back to look at his son. "Would that be okay with you? If Miss Olivia was more than just a friend to me?" Mason had shrugged with the easy acceptance of childhood. "I guess. I mean, Tommy's dad has a girlfriend, and she's nice, and Miss Olivia's already nice, so it would be the same, just with a different name." If only it were that simple. But Daniel had filed away the conversation, relieved that Mason seemed open to the possibility, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. That evening, after Mason was in bed, Daniel had called Olivia. She'd answered on the second ring, her voice soft and a little breathless, like she'd run to catch the phone. "Hey. Hey yourself, too late to come over?" "It's 9:30 on a Wednesday. When has that ever been too late for us?" "I'll put coffee on." She'd arrived 10 minutes later, hair loose and wearing sweatpants and one of his hoodies that she'd somehow acquired over the past few weeks. The sight of her in his clothes had done something to him, made the whole thing feel more real. They'd settled on the couch with their coffee, and Daniel had told her about the conversation with Mason. "He asked if you were my girlfriend," Daniel had said, watching her reaction carefully. Olivia's eyes had widened slightly. "What did you tell him?" "I asked if he'd be okay with it if you were." "And?" "He said you're already nice, so it would just be the same with a different name." She'd laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I love how simple kids make complicated things." "He said it feels like a real family when you're here, that it's less lonely with 3 people instead of 2. The laughter had faded from Olivia's face, replaced by something more serious. "Daniel, I'm not trying to pressure you. I just thought you should know that he's already attached to you, that if we do this, really do this, and it doesn't work out, he'll be hurt." "I know. I've been thinking about that too." She'd set down her coffee, turning to face him fully. "I would never hurt him intentionally. You have to know that." "I do. But I also can't promise that nothing will ever go wrong between us, that we won't have fights or disagreements or moments where we question everything. That's not realistic. I'm not asking for realistic. I'm asking if you're willing to try, to put in the work even when it's hard." "I am," she'd said without hesitation. "Daniel, I care about Mason almost as much as I care about you. He's incredible and sweet, and I love spending time with him. The idea of hurting him makes me physically ill. But I also think kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. And I think the best thing we can do for him is model what a healthy relationship looks like. Communication, respect, honesty. Even if it doesn't work out in the long run, those are valuable lessons." "So you've been thinking about this?" "Constantly, haven't you?" "Yeah, it's pretty much all I think about anymore." She'd reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. "Then let's stop overthinking. Let's just be together and see what happens. We don't have to tell Mason anything official yet. We can just keep doing what we're doing, slowly. But slowly had proven difficult when every cell in Daniel's body wanted to pull her closer, to skip ahead to the part where this felt secure instead of precarious. Still, they'd tried. They'd maintained boundaries, kept their relationship mostly private from Mason, taken things one day at a time. Until the night everything shifted again. It had been a Saturday in late November, cold enough that frost painted the windows and breath fogged in the air. Mason had been invited to a sleepover at his friend Tommy's house, his first ever sleepover, which had prompted a 30-minute discussion about what to pack and whether his stuffed dinosaur would be too babyish. All the kids bring stuffed animals, Daniel had assured him, zipping up the overnight bag. Mr. Rex will be fine. But what if they make fun of me? Then you tell them Mr. Rex is a fearsome predator who doesn't care what they think. Mason had giggled, the anxiety melting. Okay. Daniel had dropped him off at 6, endured Tommy's enthusiastic mother explaining the schedule in exhaustive detail, and driven home to an empty house for the first time in recent memory. The silence had been strange, disorienting. He'd texted Olivia. Mason's at his first sleepover. House feels weird without him. Her response had come almost immediately. Want company? I can bring wine. Please. She'd arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of red wine and Thai takeout, somehow knowing that Daniel wouldn't have thought about dinner for himself. They'd eaten at the kitchen table, talking about their weeks, and then migrated to the living room where the evening news played quietly in the background, neither of them really watching. This is nice, Olivia had said, curled into the corner of the couch with her wine glass. Quiet. Too quiet. I keep expecting to hear Mason asking for something. You're a good dad, you know that? The way you are with him. Patient, present. It's really beautiful to watch. Daniel had felt heat creep up his neck. I'm just doing my best. Most days I feel like I'm making it up as I go. That's what all good parents feel like, I think. The bad ones are the ones who think they have all the answers. Did your dad think he had all the answers? It was a bold question, one that pushed against the boundaries they usually maintained. But the wine and the quiet and the absence of Mason had created a bubble of intimacy that invited deeper honesty. Olivia had been quiet for a long moment, staring into her wine. My dad thought work had all the answers. After my mom died, he threw himself into his consulting job, traveled constantly, left me with neighbors or alone, depending on how old I was. I think he loved me, in his way. He just didn't know how to be present for grief, mine or his own. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. I've made peace with it mostly, but it's why I am the way I am. Why I learned to depend only on myself. And now? She'd met his eyes. Now I'm learning that depending on someone doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human. Daniel had set down his wine glass and moved closer until they were sharing the same cushion, until he could feel her warmth against his side. I'm learning that too. I've spent so long trying to be completely self-sufficient, to prove I don't need help, that I almost forgot how good it feels to have someone. Is that what I am? Someone? You're not just someone, Olivia. He'd struggled for words that felt adequate. You're the person I want to tell about my day, the person whose opinion matters when I'm making decisions, the person who makes me want to be better, not because you demand it, but because you deserve it. Daniel, her voice had been soft, almost wondering. I'm falling for you, past tense, present tense, future tense, all of it. The confession had hung between them, enormous and irrevocable. Olivia had set down her own wine glass, hands trembling slightly. I'm scared, she'd whispered. Me too. What if we mess this up? What if we don't? She'd kissed him then, and it had been different from the careful kisses they'd shared before. This one had been deeper, more urgent, full of all the wanting they'd been carefully rationing. Daniel had pulled her closer, his hand sliding into her hair, and she'd made a small sound against his mouth that had shot straight through him. They'd broken apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. Mason's not home, Olivia had said, the words barely audible. No. We're alone. Yes. I don't want to rush this, but I also don't want to keep waiting when we both know what we want. Daniel's heart had been hammering. Olivia, I need you to be sure, because if we cross this line, I'm sure. She'd pulled back to look at him, her hazel eyes clear and certain. I've never been more sure of anything. He'd searched her face for doubt and found none. Upstairs? Upstairs. They'd climbed the stairs to his bedroom, hands clasped, the moment feeling both momentous and natural. Daniel's room was simple, a queen bed with a navy comforter, mismatched nightstands, walls bare except for a few of Mason's drawings he'd framed. It wasn't romantic or impressive, just honest. "I should tell you," Daniel had said, suddenly nervous. "It's been a while since Me too. And I don't want you to think this is just about..." Olivia had pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "I know what this is. I know what you mean to me. This isn't casual, Daniel. Not for me. Not for me either." She'd kissed him again, slower this time, and Daniel had let himself fall into it, into her, into the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone in completely. They'd moved together with a combination of urgency and tenderness, learning each other, discovering what made the other gasp or sigh or grip tighter. Later, much later, they'd lain tangled together in Daniel's bed, the streetlight casting shadows across the ceiling, both catching their breath and trying to process what had just shifted between them. "Still scared?" Daniel had asked, running his fingers through her hair. "Terrified. You?" "Absolutely. But good terrified. The best kind." She'd turned in his arms to face him. "I need you to know something. I don't do this. I don't jump into bed with people. I've been with 3 people in my entire life, and 2 of them were serious relationships. This matters to me." "It matters to me, too." He'd pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I know this is fast. We've only officially been together for a few weeks." "Has it only been weeks? It feels longer, like we've been building to this for much longer." "We have been. Since you moved in. Maybe since that first day when Mason brought you cookies and you looked so overwhelmed but smiled anyway." "I knew you were going to be trouble," she'd said, but she'd been smiling. "Good trouble or bad trouble?" "The best kind." They'd stayed like that for hours, talking in the darkness about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, embarrassing moments, dreams they'd abandoned and dreams they still held. Daniel had told her about his architecture aspirations, about the buildings he'd sketched as a kid, about the small part of him that still wondered what if. Olivia had shared her fear of being like her father, of disappearing into work to avoid feeling, of ending up alone. "You're not alone," Daniel had said firmly. "Not anymore." "Promise?" "I promise." At some point they dozed off, wrapped around each other, and Daniel had woken just before dawn to find Olivia watching him with an expression that made his chest tight. "What?" he'd asked sleepily. "Nothing, just storing this moment in case I need it later." "Need it for what?" "For when I'm scared. To remind myself that this is real, that I didn't imagine it." He'd pulled her closer, pressing kisses to her temple, her cheek, her lips. "It's real. I'm real. This is happening. I should probably go home before Mason gets back. What time is Tommy's mom dropping him off?" 10. Daniel had checked his phone, 6:15. "We have time. Stay a little longer." She had. They'd made coffee and breakfast, moving around each other in Daniel's kitchen with an ease that felt practiced despite being new. They'd sat at the table in the early morning light, hands clasped across the surface, stealing kisses between bites of toast. "This feels domestic," Olivia had observed. "Is that okay?" "It's perfect." At 9:30, she'd slipped back to her own house to shower and change, and Daniel had straightened up his bedroom, changed the sheets, erased the evidence of the night before. Not because he was ashamed, he wasn't, but because he wanted to tell Mason about their relationship on their own terms, not because his 7-year-old stumbled onto clues. Mason had arrived home at 10:15, bursting with stories about the sleepover, talking a mile a minute about the movies they'd watched and the fort they'd built, and how Tommy's older sister had let them stay up until midnight. "Sounds like you had fun," Daniel had said, ruffling his son's hair. "The best. Can I have another sleepover soon?" "We'll see. Why don't you go unpack your bag?" Mason had thundered upstairs, and Daniel had allowed himself a moment to breathe, to process the seismic shift of the past 12 hours. He'd crossed a line with Olivia. They'd become something irreversible, and it felt right and terrifying and wonderful all at once. His phone had buzzed with a text from her. "How's Mason? Wired on sugar and no sleep." "How are you?" "Happy. scared, floating. You? Same. No regrets, not even one. The following week had been a study in balancing dual lives. The public one where they were friendly neighbors who spent time together, and the private one where they were falling in love. They'd stolen moments alone whenever possible. Quick kisses when Mason ran inside to grab a toy. Longer conversations on the phone after bedtime. One afternoon when Mason was at school and Daniel had finished work early, Olivia had come over and they'd christened the couch, the kitchen counter, and nearly the hallway before reason had prevailed, and they'd remembered that Daniel's neighbors weren't blind. We should probably talk about what we're doing, Olivia had said afterward, straightening her clothes and trying to tame her hair. I thought we were doing a very good job of not overthinking. I'm serious. We can't keep sneaking around forever. At some point, we need to tell Mason. Tell people. Daniel had sobered. I know, I just want to make sure we're solid first. That this isn't just infatuation or convenience or it's not. How do you know? Because infatuation fades when things get difficult. And you've seen me difficult. You've seen me jealous and insecure and closed off. And you're still here. Of course I'm still here. That's how I know it's real. They'd agreed to tell Mason after Thanksgiving. Give themselves one more month to solidify what they were building. One more month before they invited the outside world, and Mason's inevitable questions, into their fragile new relationship. Thanksgiving had arrived with snow flurries and temperatures in the 20s. Daniel's mother had called, inviting them to Florida for the holiday, but Daniel had declined. The flight would be expensive, and honestly, he'd wanted to stay home, to build new traditions instead of revisiting old ones that came with judgment about his life choices. What are you doing for Thanksgiving? He'd asked Olivia one evening. Nothing. I usually just make myself a small meal and watch movies. Very glamorous. Have Thanksgiving with us. Daniel, that's a family holiday. You are family, to me and to Mason. Please, I want you there. She'd agreed, and Daniel had spent the days leading up to Thanksgiving planning the menu with Mason, shopping for ingredients, preparing dishes in advance. He'd wanted everything to be perfect. Their first holiday together. Thanksgiving morning had dawned cold and clear. Daniel and Mason had woken early to put the turkey in the oven, and Olivia had arrived at 9 with homemade cinnamon rolls and a green bean casserole. They'd cooked together, the three of them, the kitchen warm and fragrant with roasting meat and baking bread. Mason had helped Olivia make a centerpiece from pine cones and fall leaves, while Daniel had mashed potatoes and made gravy. It had felt right, natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. They'd eaten at 2 in the afternoon, the table set with Daniel's grandmother's china and mismatched cloth napkins. Mason had insisted they each say what they were thankful for before eating. I'm thankful for this food and for Dad and for Miss Olivia and for my friends and for Mr. Rex, Mason had said, rattling off his list with 7-year-old earnestness. I'm thankful for my son, who makes every day an adventure, Daniel had said, squeezing Mason's hand, and for good neighbors who become great friends. He'd caught Olivia's eye, and she'd blushed. I'm thankful for second chances, she'd said softly, and for people who are brave enough to let me in, and for beautiful, kind boys who remind me why I love teaching. Mason had beamed, not understanding the weight behind her words, but basking in the praise nonetheless. After dinner, they'd watched the parade on TV while Mason had played with his toys. Daniel and Olivia had sat close on the couch, not quite touching, but aware of each other's proximity, maintaining the fiction of friendly distance even as their hearts raced. This was perfect, Olivia had whispered during a commercial break. Yeah, it was. I don't want to leave. Then don't. Stay for a movie. Stay for dessert. Stay as long as you want. She'd stayed until after Mason's bedtime, helping with the dishes and leftover storage, and then she'd lingered in the doorway, coat on, but not leaving. I should go, she'd said, making no move to do so. Probably. Daniel? Yeah? I love this, being here with you both, feeling like I belong somewhere. You do belong here. I'm ready. Ready for what? To tell Mason, to stop hiding, to actually be your girlfriend instead of your secret. Daniel's heart had kicked up. Are you sure? I'm sure. We said we'd tell him after Thanksgiving. It's after Thanksgiving. It's literally the same day. Semantics. He'd laughed, pulling her into his arms. Okay, we'll tell him this weekend, together. Together, she'd agreed and kissed him goodnight. The weekend had arrived with clear skies and nervous energy. Daniel had made pancakes for breakfast while Olivia had slept in at her own house, preparing herself for the conversation ahead. They'd agreed she'd come over around 10 and they'd talk to Mason together. When she'd arrived, looking beautiful and terrified in jeans and a soft sweater, Daniel had squeezed her hand. Ready? He'd asked. Not even a little. You? Same. They'd found Mason in the living room, building an elaborate Lego structure, and had sat down on the floor with him. Hey, buddy, Miss Olivia and I need to talk to you about something, Daniel had started, his heart pounding. Mason had looked up, instantly wary. Am I in trouble? No, nothing like that. We just want to tell you something. Okay? Mason had set down his Legos, giving them his full attention. Daniel had glanced at Olivia, who'd nodded encouragement. You know how you asked me if Miss Olivia was my girlfriend? Yeah. Well, she is. We've been spending time together, just the two of us, and we really care about each other. So we wanted to tell you that we're dating, like, officially. Mason had processed this information with a serious expression. Then finally, does this mean she'll be here more? Would that be okay with you? Olivia had asked gently. Yeah, I like when you're here. You're nice and you help with homework and you make good cookies. Daniel had laughed, relief flooding through him. So you're okay with this? I guess. Does this mean you'll get married? Whoa, slow down. We're just dating right now, getting to know each other better. But you already know each other. We're learning new things, Olivia had explained, about how we work together as more than friends. It's important to take our time with these things. Mason had seemed to accept this. Can I still call you Miss Olivia? Of course, whatever makes you comfortable. Okay. Can I go back to my Legos now? And just like that, the conversation had ended. No drama, no tears, no complicated emotions. Just a child accepting the reality presented to him and moving on. After Mason had returned to his building project, Daniel and Olivia had retreated to the kitchen. That was easier than expected, Olivia had whispered. Too easy. I feel like we got away with something. Don't jinx it. But the ease had held. Over the following days, Mason had adjusted to the new dynamic with minimal fuss. He'd started holding both their hands when they walked places. He'd asked Olivia to tuck him in alongside Daniel. He'd drawn pictures of the three of them and hung them on the refrigerator. It was, Daniel had realized, exactly what Mason had wanted all along. Not a replacement for his mother, he rarely mentioned Ashley and seemed content with their phone calls and summer visits. But in addition to his family, another person to love him and be loved by him. December had arrived with heavy snow and Christmas decorations appearing on every porch. Daniel and Olivia had decorated his house together while Mason had directed operations with the authority of a 7-year-old tyrant. They'd strung lights, hung stockings, set up the tree. One evening, after Mason was asleep, they'd sat in the darkened living room with only the Christmas tree lights glowing, casting everything in warm color. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, Olivia had admitted, nestled against Daniel's side. Why? Because things don't usually work out this well for me. There's always a catch, always a complication. Maybe this time there isn't. Or maybe we just haven't found it yet. Daniel had turned to face her, serious now. Olivia, I can't promise everything will always be perfect. We'll fight. We'll have bad days. There will be complications because that's life. But I can promise that I'm committed to working through them, to not running when things get hard. Can you promise the same? She'd nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. I promise. Then that's enough. We don't need perfect. We just need committed. They'd kissed in the glow of the tree, and Daniel had thought about how far they'd both come. Two guarded people who'd built walls around their hearts, slowly learning to dismantle them brick by careful brick. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real was better than perfect any day. The first real test came 2 weeks before Christmas, on a Tuesday evening that started ordinary and ended with everything feeling uncertain. Daniel had been finishing up a kitchen renovation for a client across town, running later than expected because the tile work had been more complicated than anticipated. He'd texted Olivia around 4 to let her know, and she'd responded immediately that she'd pick Mason up from school and keep him entertained until Daniel got home. It was the kind of thing they did now, seamlessly covering for each other, functioning as a unit. Mason's after-school care had become a shared responsibility. Dinner plans were made together, weekends were assumed to be collective rather than individual. In just a few weeks, they'd woven their lives together so completely that Daniel sometimes forgot there'd been a time when Olivia wasn't part of their daily routine. He'd arrived home around 6:30, covered in tile dust and grout, to find his house filled with the smell of baking and the sound of laughter. Following the noise to the kitchen, he'd found Mason and Olivia making gingerbread cookies, flour everywhere, both of them wearing matching grins. "Dad!" Mason had shouted, running over to hug him despite Daniel's protests about being dirty. "We're making a gingerbread village. Miss Olivia showed me how to make the walls stand up." I can see that," Daniel had said, surveying the chaos with affection. "Looks like a delicious disaster." "The best kind," Olivia had said, meeting his eyes with a warmth that still made his heart skip. She'd had flour on her cheek and icing in her hair, and Daniel had thought she'd never looked more beautiful. He'd showered quickly and returned to help with the gingerbread construction, the three of them working together until Mason's eyelids had started drooping around 8:30. They'd gotten him ready for bed, and Daniel had been reading him his bedtime story when Mason had said, voice sleepy and content, "I wish Miss Olivia could stay here all the time." "She lives next door, buddy. That's pretty close." "But not the same. Tommy's dad's girlfriend lives with them now. She has her own room and everything." Daniel's chest had tightened. "That's different. Tommy's dad and his girlfriend have been together longer than Miss Olivia and me." "How much longer?" "I don't know. A while." "Will Miss Olivia ever live here?" "Maybe someday, if that's what we all want. But that's a big decision that we'd need to talk about together." "I'd want it," Mason had said simply. "I like our family better with 3 people." After Mason had fallen asleep, Daniel had found Olivia cleaning up the kitchen, and he'd wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his face into her hair. "Mason asked when you're moving in," he'd said. He'd felt her stiffen slightly. "What did you tell him?" "That it's something we'd all need to talk about together. That it's not happening right now." She'd turned in his arms, her expression difficult to read. "And what do you think about it?" "Honestly, the practical part of me thinks it's way too soon. We've been officially together for less than 2 months. People don't move in together after 2 months. And the impractical part? The impractical part wants you here all the time. Wants to wake up with you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. Wants to stop saying goodbye at the door and pretending we have separate lives when we both know we don't anymore." Olivia had been quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on his chest. "I've been thinking about it too. About how much time I spend here versus at my own house. About how my house is starting to feel like just a place I sleep instead of home. And what conclusion did you reach?" "That I'm terrified of moving too fast. Of making the same mistakes I made before. Jumping in without thinking, assuming love is enough to overcome practical problems. My ex and I moved in together after 3 months, and it was a disaster. We weren't ready. We didn't know each other well enough. We're not them." "I know. But the fear is still there." Daniel had pulled her closer, understanding the weight of old wounds. "Then we don't rush it. We keep things as they are. There's no timeline here, Olivia. No deadline. We move at whatever pace feels right. What if the right pace is different for both of us? Then we communicate about it, like adults. Like we've been doing." She'd nodded against his chest, but Daniel had felt the tension in her shoulders, the way she'd held herself a little too tightly. Something was bothering her beyond the logistics of moving in together. "What else is going on?" he'd asked gently. "Nothing." "Olivia." She'd pulled back to look at him, and he'd seen worry in her hazel eyes. "My dad called today." Daniel had waited, knowing from the few conversations they'd had about her father that this wasn't good news. "He's getting remarried. Some woman he met 6 months ago. He wanted to tell me before he sent the wedding invitation." Her voice had been carefully controlled, empty of emotion. "He also wanted to let me know that he's selling the house in Portland, the house I grew up in, the last place I have any memories of my mother." "Olivia, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. It's his house. He can do what he wants with it." But her eyes had been too bright, her jaw too tight. You're allowed to be upset about this. I'm not upset. She'd stopped, swallowing hard. I'm angry. He waited 10 years after Mom died to even date anyone. 10 years of being emotionally unavailable to his daughter, of prioritizing work over family, of making me feel like I was a burden he couldn't wait to be rid of. And now suddenly he meets someone, and 6 months later he's ready to get married and sell our family home and start fresh like none of that history matters. Have you told him how you feel? What's the point? He won't understand. He never does. He'll just tell me I'm being emotional or dramatic or that I should be happy for him. Daniel had cupped her face in his hands, making her look at him. You're allowed to be emotional. You're allowed to grieve the home you're losing and be angry at your father for moving on without considering your feelings. Those are valid reactions, and anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. The first tear had slipped down her cheek then, followed by others. I shouldn't care this much. It's just a house. It's not just a house. It's your mother's memory, your childhood, your history. She'd broken down then, sobbing against his chest while Daniel had held her, murmuring comfort and letting her cry out years of resentment and grief. They'd ended up on the couch, Olivia curled into his side, talking through her complicated relationship with her father, the distance, the disappointment, the persistent hope that someday he'd be the parent she needed him to be. I moved here to get away from all of it, she'd said, voice hoarse from crying. From him, from my ex, from all the reminders of who I used to be. I thought I could build a new life where none of that baggage mattered. But you can't outrun your past. No, it just follows you in different forms. She'd looked up at him, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen. I'm terrified of becoming like him, Daniel, of shutting down emotionally when things get hard, of running from intimacy and using work or independence as an excuse to avoid real connection. You're not like him. How do you know? Because you're here, having this conversation with me instead of shutting me out. Because you let yourself cry and be vulnerable instead of pretending everything's fine. Because you show up for Mason and for me consistently, even when it would be easier to keep your distance. I don't want to hurt you, she'd whispered. Either of you. But I'm scared that my damage might be too much. That eventually you'll realize I'm not worth the complication. Daniel had tilted her chin up, making sure she could see the sincerity in his eyes. Listen to me. Everyone has damage. Everyone has baggage and fears and old wounds that haven't quite healed. That doesn't make you too much or not enough. It makes you human. And I'm not going anywhere just because things get complicated. In fact, I'd argue that working through complicated together is what builds real intimacy. You say that now. I mean it now, and I'll mean it later. He'd kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We're in this together, remember? The good and the bad and the messy middle. That's what we signed up for. She'd stayed that night, the first time she'd slept over with Mason in the house. Daniel had given her pajamas and a toothbrush, and they'd lain in his bed talking until late, working through her feelings about her father, about the house, about what it meant to grieve someone who was still alive but emotionally absent. In the morning, Mason had found them making breakfast together and had accepted Olivia's presence with easy grace, chattering about school while eating pancakes. If he'd wondered why she was there so early, wearing Daniel's clothes, he hadn't asked. But the conversation with her father had opened something in Olivia, a wound that hadn't quite healed. Over the following days, Daniel had noticed her pulling back slightly, not dramatically, not in ways that most people would catch. But he'd learned to read her moods, her small tells. She'd been quieter than usual, more in her own head. She'd still come over for dinner, still helped with Mason, still kissed Daniel goodnight. But there'd been a distance that hadn't been there before. Finally, 3 days before Christmas, Daniel had confronted her about it. Mason had been at a friend's house for the afternoon, and Daniel had found Olivia sitting on her porch, despite the freezing temperatures, staring at nothing. Talk to me, he'd said, sitting beside her. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been pulling away for days. She'd been quiet for so long he'd thought she might not answer. Then, softly, I talked to my dad again. He wants me to come to Portland for Christmas, to meet his fiancée, to be part of his new family. And I don't want to go. But I also feel guilty for not wanting to go, like I'm being petty or holding grudges. What do you want to do for Christmas? I want to stay here, with you and Mason. I want to keep the traditions we started at Thanksgiving. I want to wake up Christmas morning in a house that feels like home instead of flying across the country to feel like a stranger in my father's new life. Then stay. It's not that simple. Why not? Because he's my father. Because I'm supposed to make an effort. Because what if I regret it later? What if something happens to him and I never... Her voice had cracked. Daniel had taken her hand cold from the winter air. Olivia, you can't make decisions based on guilt or fear of future regret. You have to make them based on what's right for you now, in this moment. And if what's right for you is staying here and building new traditions, instead of forcing yourself into uncomfortable situations out of obligation, that's valid. You don't think I'm being selfish? I think you're being honest about what you need. That's not selfish. That's healthy. She'd leaned against him, and they'd sat there in the cold until they'd both started shivering. Then they'd gone inside, made hot chocolate, and Olivia had called her father to tell him she wouldn't be coming to Portland. The conversation had been brief and tense, her father's disappointment evident even from where Daniel sat across the room. When she'd hung up, she'd looked drained. He said I was choosing strangers over family. You're choosing your family. It just looks different than his. He doesn't understand. Maybe he doesn't need to. Maybe you just need to be okay with your choice, regardless of his approval. That's easier said than done. Most important things are. Christmas Eve had arrived with heavy snowfall and roads that were treacherous but beautiful. Daniel had taken Mason shopping earlier in the week, helping him pick out a gift for Olivia, a framed drawing Mason had made of the three of them, carefully labeled My Family. Daniel had found a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a house, a symbol of belonging that he'd hoped would resonate. They'd spent the afternoon baking cookies and watching Christmas movies, the house warm and fragrant with cinnamon and sugar. Olivia had seemed lighter than she'd been all week, laughing at Mason's antics and singing along badly to Christmas carols. After dinner, they'd bundled up and walked through the neighborhood to look at Christmas lights, Mason running ahead to crunch through untouched snow while Daniel and Olivia followed hand in hand. I made the right choice, Olivia had said quietly. Staying here. This is where I want to be. I'm glad. I keep waiting for it to feel wrong, choosing you and Mason over my father, but it doesn't. It feels like the first truly honest decision I've made in years. They'd stopped under a streetlight, snow falling softly around them, and Olivia had turned to face him, her expression serious. Daniel, I need to tell you something. His heart had kicked up at her tone. Okay? I love you. I'm in love with you. I've been fighting it because it feels too fast and too intense, and I'm terrified of getting hurt again. But the truth is, I fell for you months ago. Probably the night you sat with me in the rain and didn't say anything, just stayed. And it's been growing every day since then, and I need you to know that, even though it scares me to say it. Daniel had felt something unlock in his chest, warm and overwhelming. I love you too. I've been holding back from saying it because I didn't want to pressure you or make you feel like things were moving too fast. But I've loved you for a while now. Probably since the day you got jealous over Harper, and I realized you felt the same way I did. She'd laughed, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him there in the snow while Mason had run back to them shouting about a house with inflatable reindeer. Miss Olivia is crying, Mason had announced, worried. Happy tears, she'd assured him, kneeling down to his level. I'm just really, really happy to be here with you both. Me too, Mason had said, hugging her tightly. This is the best Christmas ever, and it's not even Christmas yet. They'd walked home through the quiet streets, Mason between them holding both their hands, and Daniel had thought about how far they'd all come, how three separate guarded people had found each other and built something real. That night, after Mason had gone to bed, Daniel and Olivia had exchanged their gifts. She'd given him a leather-bound sketchbook and expensive drawing pencils. For the architect you used to be, she'd said. Maybe still are, just in different ways. I thought you might like to start sketching again, not for work, just for yourself. He'd been speechless, touched by the thoughtfulness of it. Then he'd given her the bracelet, and when she'd read the small inscription on the back of the house charm, "Home is where your story begins," she'd cried again. It's perfect, she'd whispered. You're perfect. I'm really not. Perfect for me then. Perfect for us. They'd made love slowly that night with more emotion than urgency, saying with their bodies what words couldn't quite capture. And afterward, lying tangled together in Daniel's bed, Olivia had said, "I want to tell you something else." "I'm listening." "I've been thinking about what Mason said, about me moving in, and I know we said it was too soon, and maybe it is, but I also think sometimes timing matters less than certainty. And I'm certain about this, about us, about wanting to build a life together instead of maintaining separate ones." Daniel's heart had been racing. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I want to move in. Not right now, not tomorrow, but soon. Maybe after the holidays, once we've had time to talk through the logistics and make sure it's what everyone wants. But I want you to know that I'm ready, that I'm not running scared anymore." What changed? Choosing to stay here for Christmas, choosing you and Mason over obligation and guilt. It made me realize that I've been so afraid of making the wrong choice that I've been paralyzed. But standing still is also a choice, and it's not the one I want to make anymore. Daniel had pulled her closer, kissing her temple. "We'll talk about it, all three of us. Make sure Mason understands what it means, make sure we're all on the same page. But for the record, I want this too. I want you here, permanently. I want to stop pretending we have separate lives." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Christmas morning had been chaos in the best possible way. Mason had woken them up at 6, bouncing on the bed with excitement, and they'd stumbled downstairs to find presents under the tree and stockings hung carefully on the mantel. They'd opened gifts in their pajamas, drinking hot chocolate and eating cinnamon rolls, and Daniel had watched Mason's face light up with each new present. When Mason had opened the gift from Olivia, a professional art set with paints and brushes and canvases, he'd thrown his arms around her and said, "This is the best present ever. Now I can be a real artist like you." "You're already a real artist," she'd said, hugging him back. "This just gives you more tools to create with." Daniel had given Mason the Lego set he'd been wanting for months, and Mason had immediately started building, abandoning wrapping paper and boxes in favor of tiny plastic bricks. Later, while Mason had been absorbed in his project, Daniel and Olivia had cleaned up the wrapping paper mess, working in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Daniel had said. "For what?" "For being here. For being part of this. For loving my son and making him feel special." "I don't have to try to make him feel special. He is special. You've raised an incredible kid, Daniel." "We're raising an incredible kid," he'd corrected, "because you're part of this now, too." She'd smiled, that soft, private smile she reserved just for him. "Yeah, I guess I am." That afternoon, they'd decided to take a walk to the park despite the cold, all three of them bundled up in layers. The park had been empty, snow untouched and pristine, and Mason had immediately started building a snowman. Daniel and Olivia had helped, packing snow and finding sticks for arms and stones for eyes. When the snowman had been completed, lopsided but charming, Mason had declared it looked like their family. "How does a snowman look like our family?" Daniel had asked, amused. "Because it's made of 3 parts. The bottom is you, Dad, because you're the biggest and you hold everything up. The middle is Miss Olivia because she's right in the middle of us. And the top is me because I'm the smallest but also the head, which is important." Daniel and Olivia had exchanged glances, both trying not to laugh at the 7-year-old logic. "That's a very good observation," Olivia had said seriously. "I think you might be a philosopher as well as an artist." "What's a philosopher?" "Someone who thinks deeply about life and asks big questions." Mason had considered this. "Then yeah, I'm probably that too." On the walk home, Mason had run ahead again, and Daniel had pulled Olivia close. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," he'd said. "Me too. I can't remember the last time I felt this content, like everything is exactly where it should be." "It is. You are." She'd stopped walking, turning to face him. The sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink, and her eyes had been bright with emotion. "I meant what I said last night, about moving in. I know we still need to talk to Mason, still need to figure out the details, but I want you to know that I'm serious. This isn't just holiday sentiment or caught up in the moment feelings. I want to build a life with you, Daniel, a real, permanent, messy, beautiful life." He'd kissed her there in the middle of the street, not caring who might see, pouring everything he felt into it: love, gratitude, hope, certainty. "Then let's build it," he'd said when they'd finally pulled apart. "Together, all three of us." Mason had called back to them, "Come on, I'm freezing." They'd laughed and run to catch up with him, and walking home through the Christmas evening, Daniel had felt a certainty settle deep in his bones. This was his family now, not just him and Mason anymore, but the three of them together. It wasn't perfect. They'd still have challenges, still have moments of doubt and fear. Olivia's past would resurface. His own insecurities would flare up. Mason would have questions and adjustments to make. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. That evening, after a dinner of leftovers and more cookies than any of them should have eaten, they'd gathered in the living room. Daniel had built a fire in the fireplace, and they'd turned off all the lights except the Christmas tree, the room glowing with warm color. "Mason, we need to talk to you about something important," Daniel had started, nervous despite the earlier conversation. Mason had looked up from his Legos, suddenly serious. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's great," Olivia had assured him. "We just want to ask you something." "Okay," Daniel had taken a breath. "How would you feel if Miss Olivia moved in with us? If she lived here instead of next door?" Mason's eyes had gone wide. "Really? For real?" "For real. But only if you're okay with it." "Would she have her own room?" "She'd share a room with me," Daniel had explained. "But we'd make sure you still have your own space, and everything would stay the same in terms of your routine and your stuff." Mason had thought about this, his young face serious with consideration. Then, carefully, "Would she be like my mom?" The question had hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel had glanced at Olivia, who'd looked uncertain how to respond. "I would never try to replace your mom," Olivia had said gently. "She's your mom, and that's something special that belongs just to you and her. But I love you very much, and I'd be here every day, helping take care of you and being part of your family, if you wanted me to be." "Like a bonus mom?" "Exactly like that." Mason had nodded slowly. "I think that would be okay. Better than okay. I like having you here, and it would be nice not to say goodbye every night." Relief had flooded through Daniel. "So you're good with this?" "Yeah, can she bring her cookies over when she moves?" They'd all laughed, the tension breaking. "I'll bring everything," Olivia had promised. "Cookies, art supplies, all of it." "When is she moving in?" "We're not sure yet. We need to figure out some details first, but probably after New Year's." "That's so long." "It's less than 2 weeks," Daniel had said, ruffling his son's hair. But Mason had already moved on. Returning to his Legos with the easy acceptance of childhood, the matter settled in his mind. Later that night, after Mason had finally crashed from sugar and excitement, Daniel and Olivia had sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, both of them processing what they'd just committed to. "Are we really doing this?" Olivia had asked quietly. "Looks like it." "I'm terrified." "Me too. But good terrified." "Of the best kind," Daniel had echoed, and kissed the top of her head. They'd sat there until the fire burned down to embers, making plans and dreaming aloud about their future. What furniture Olivia would bring, what they'd do with her house. Maybe rent it out. Maybe sell it eventually. How they'd merge their lives practically and emotionally. What it would mean for Mason, for their relationship, for everything. It was overwhelming and exciting and scary all at once. But sitting there in the glow of the dying fire, with the woman he loved in his arms and his son sleeping peacefully upstairs, Daniel had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope for the future. And for a man who'd spent so long protecting himself and his son from disappointment, who'd built his life around careful choices and measured risks, that hope felt like the greatest gift he could have received. Better than anything under the tree. Better than anything he'd dared imagine. The kiss that had changed everything had started this journey. But the love they'd built together, honest, vulnerable, brave, that's what would carry them forward. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of planning and packing, of practicalities that made the abstract suddenly concrete. Olivia had given notice to her landlord that she'd be vacating by mid-January, and they'd spent every spare moment sorting through her belongings, deciding what would make the transition to Daniel's house and what would go into storage or be donated. It was in these mundane tasks that the reality of what they were doing truly hit. Daniel stood in Olivia's bedroom one afternoon, helping her fold clothes into boxes, and realized that in a matter of weeks, this space would be empty. She'd be gone from this house that had been her sanctuary for 2 years, the place where she'd rebuilt herself after heartbreak and family disappointment. "Having second thoughts?" Olivia had asked, catching him staring at the half-empty closet. "No, you." "Every 5 minutes." She'd laughed, but there'd been an edge to it. "Is that normal?" "I think so. This is a big step. We're allowed to be nervous about it." She'd sat down on the edge of her bed, surrounded by boxes and packing tape. "What if we're making a mistake? What if moving in together ruins what we have?" Daniel had sat beside her, taking her hand. "What if it doesn't? What if it's exactly what we need to take this to the next level?" "You sound very confident for someone who admitted he was terrified." "I'm terrified and confident. They're not mutually exclusive." He'd squeezed her fingers. "Look, I can't promise this will be seamless. We're going to have adjustments to make. You're going to discover I leave dishes in the sink sometimes and I'm grumpy before coffee. I'm going to discover things about you that annoy me. That's just what happens when you live with someone." Very romantic, Hayes. "I'm being realistic. But the thing is, I'd rather deal with dirty dishes and morning grumpiness and all the small irritations of cohabitation than keep living separate lives. Wouldn't you?" She'd leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, I would. I'm just scared of losing myself in this, of becoming so absorbed in being your partner and Mason's bonus mom that I forget who I am as just Olivia." "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. You keep your art studio space. You keep your girls' nights with your teacher friends. You keep the parts of your life that are just yours. This isn't about losing yourself. It's about adding to what you already have." "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple, but it's worth it." They'd continued packing, and Daniel had made mental notes about what furniture would fit where, what they'd need to rearrange, how to make space for Olivia's life within the framework of the home he'd built with Mason. It was like solving a puzzle, finding ways to blend two separate existences into one cohesive whole. The day before New Year's Eve, Ashley had called. Daniel had been in the garage organizing tools to make room for Olivia's gardening equipment when his phone had buzzed with her name. He'd stared at it for 3 rings before answering, his stomach tight with apprehension. Ashley never called unless something was wrong or she wanted something. "Daniel, hey," she'd said, her voice bright and artificial. "How are you?" "I'm good. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I just wanted to touch base about summer visitation. Mark and I are thinking about taking Mason to Hawaii for 2 weeks in July, and I wanted to make sure that worked with your schedule." Daniel had gripped the phone tighter. 2 weeks in Hawaii with her new husband, while he stayed home and worried. "That's a long trip," he'd said carefully. "Mason's never been away from home that long." "Which is exactly why it would be good for him. He needs to experience new things, Daniel. You can't keep him in your little bubble forever." The criticism had stung, even though he'd heard variations of it before. Ashley had always thought he was too protective, too cautious, too focused on stability at the expense of adventure. "I'm not keeping him in a bubble. I'm giving him a stable childhood." "Same thing, really," she'd sighed. "Look, I'm not trying to start a fight. I just think Mason would benefit from seeing the world a little. And it would give you a break. You could actually take a vacation for once instead of working yourself to death." "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." "Oh, and Daniel, Mason mentioned something about you having a girlfriend when we talked on Christmas. Is that true?" He'd tensed, not sure why he felt defensive. "Yeah, her name is Olivia. She's our neighbor. How long has this been going on?" "A few months. Why?" "Just curious. I hope you're being careful about who you're bringing into Mason's life. He gets attached easily." The words had hit like a physical blow, coming from the woman who'd walked away from their son without looking back. "I'm very careful about who I bring into his life. Olivia is wonderful with him." "I'm sure she is. Just don't let your personal life disrupt his routine, okay? He needs stability." Daniel had wanted to laugh at the irony, wanted to point out that she'd been the one who'd disrupted Mason's life by leaving, but he'd bitten his tongue. Fighting with Ashley never accomplished anything. "I'll let you know about Hawaii," he'd said instead. "Thanks. Talk soon." The call had left him rattled, defensive in ways he hadn't expected. When Olivia had found him 20 minutes later, still standing in the garage staring at nothing, she'd immediately known something was wrong. What happened? Ashley called. She wants to take Mason to Hawaii for 2 weeks this summer. And that's bad because 2 weeks is a long time. Because I don't know her new husband well enough to trust him with my son for that long. Because every time she swoops in with these grand plans, I feel like I'm the villain for wanting to protect Mason's stability. Olivia had stepped closer, her hand on his arm. What do you want to do? I want to say no, but I also don't want to be the dad who keeps his kid from experiences because of his own anxieties. Those are both valid concerns. She also asked about you, told me to be careful about bringing people into Mason's life, like she has any right to give parenting advice when she sees him twice a year. He'd heard the bitterness in his own voice and hated it. Olivia had been quiet for a moment, then said gently, She's his mother. She does have a right to be concerned about who's in his life. Whose side are you on? Yours. Always. But I also think she probably feels guilty and defensive, and questioning your choices makes her feel better about her own. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. Daniel had exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain. When did you get so wise? I teach second graders. You develop perspective pretty quickly when you're mediating playground disputes all day. He'd pulled her into a hug, breathing in her familiar scent. I don't know what I'd do without you. Good thing you don't have to find out. That evening, after Mason had gone to bed, Daniel had brought up the Hawaii trip. Olivia had listened while he'd worked through his concerns aloud, asking questions but not offering solutions, letting him arrive at his own conclusions. I think I should let him go, Daniel had finally said. As much as it terrifies me, he should have that experience and Ashley is his mom, whatever our issues. I just need to make sure he knows he can call me anytime, that he has an escape route if he needs one. That sounds reasonable. Will you be here? When he's gone? I don't think I can handle an empty house for 2 weeks. I'll be here. We'll keep each other company. We could take that vacation Ashley mentioned. Go somewhere together. Olivia's eyes had lit up. Really? Where would we go? I don't know. Where have you always wanted to go? The coast, Oregon, or Washington. Somewhere with ocean and forests and good hiking. Then that's where we'll go. 2 weeks on the coast while Mason's in Hawaii. They'd spent the rest of the evening looking at rental cabins online, planning a trip that was still months away but felt important to cement. A future they were building together, one decision at a time. New Year's Eve arrived with temperatures below freezing and a forecast for more snow. They decided to stay in, all three of them, making homemade pizza and watching movies until midnight. Mason had been determined to stay awake for the ball drop, insisting he was old enough despite being barely able to keep his eyes open by 9 o'clock. I'm not tired, he'd protested, yawning widely. Of course not, Daniel had said, exchanging amused glances with Olivia. Mason had made it until 10:30 before falling asleep on the couch between them, his head on Olivia's lap, feet in Daniel's. They'd let him sleep, content to watch him breathe steadily, while some action movie played on mute. This is nice, Olivia had said softly, running her fingers through Mason's hair. All of us together, quiet and peaceful. It won't always be this peaceful. Wait until he's a teenager. Don't remind me. I'm not ready for teenage hormones and attitude. You say that now. Wait until he brings home his first girlfriend and you go full protective bonus mom. She'd laughed quietly. Is that what I am? Bonus mom? If you want to be, no pressure. I think I like it. Bonus mom. It feels right. At 11:50, they'd gently woken Mason up, and he'd been bleary-eyed but excited, watching the countdown on TV while eating the fancy cheese and crackers Olivia had prepared. When midnight struck and the ball dropped, they'd cheered quietly, not wanting to wake the neighbors. And Daniel had kissed Olivia while Mason made exaggerated gagging noises. Happy New Year to Daniel had whispered against her lips. Happy New Year. This is going to be our year. I can feel it. Confident predictions from the man who's terrified of everything. I'm terrified of everything except this. Except us. They'd put Mason to bed shortly after, and he'd been asleep before Daniel had finished tucking him in. Then Daniel and Olivia had returned to the living room, poured champagne, and toasted to the future. To new beginnings, Olivia had said. To family, Daniel had added. To taking risks that scare us. To love that's worth the fear. They'd clinked glasses and drunk, and then Olivia had set down her champagne and pulled Daniel to his feet. Dance with me. There's no music. So? We'll make our own. They'd swayed together in the quiet living room, no music but the sound of their breathing and the occasional car passing outside. It had been simple and perfect, and Daniel had thought about how much had changed in a single year. Last New Year's Eve, he'd been alone after putting Mason to bed, drinking a beer and half watching the ball drop, resigned to a life of comfortable solitude. Now he held a woman he loved, in a house that would soon be truly theirs, with a future that felt bright instead of just safe. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia had asked. "How grateful I am. For you, for this, for all of it. Me too, even though I'm terrified. Especially because you're terrified. Being brave enough to try despite the fear, that's what makes it meaningful." They'd made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings and old fears finally laid to rest. And afterward, lying tangled together in Daniel's bed, Olivia had said, "I start moving in tomorrow." "I know. Last chance to change your mind. Not a chance. Even though I'm messy and I sing off key in the shower and I get cranky when I'm hungry. Especially because of all that." She'd laughed and kissed him, and Daniel had fallen asleep with her in his arms, thinking that if this was what the rest of his life looked like, he'd be the luckiest man alive. The actual move happened gradually over the course of a week. Olivia had been right about being messy. Her organizational system seemed to involve piles of things that made sense only to her. But she'd also been right about singing in the shower, her voice cheerfully off-key and completely unself-conscious, and Daniel had found he loved it. Loved the evidence of her presence, the way she took up space in his life without apology. They'd converted the small office next to the master bedroom into Olivia's art studio, painting the walls a soft sage green and installing better lighting. She'd brought her easel and supplies, her half-finished canvases and sketches, and the room had transformed into a creative space that was purely hers. "You don't have to give me a whole room," she'd protested when Daniel had first suggested it. "Yes, I do. You need space that's just yours. Otherwise, you'll feel like you're living in my house instead of our house." "Our house," she'd repeated, testing the words. "I like how that sounds." Her furniture had been distributed throughout the house, her cozy reading chair in the living room, her kitchen table replacing Daniel's smaller one, her bookshelves lining the hallway. Slowly, the house had transformed from Daniel's space into something that belonged to all three of them. Mason had helped enthusiastically, carrying boxes that were too heavy for him and offering opinions on where everything should go. When they'd set up Olivia's reading chair, he'd immediately claimed it as his new favorite spot. "This is the comfiest chair ever," he'd announced, curling up in it with a book. "It is pretty comfortable," Olivia had agreed, "but you have to share it with me sometimes." "Okay, we can take turns." The first morning Olivia had officially lived there, Daniel had woken to find her side of the bed empty and had panicked for a moment before hearing voices from downstairs. He'd found her in the kitchen with Mason, both of them making pancakes and laughing about something. "Morning," she'd said, looking up with a smile. "We're making breakfast." "I helped crack the eggs," Mason had added proudly. "Only one piece of shell fell in." Daniel had leaned against the doorframe, taking in the scene, his son and the woman he loved, working together in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows. It had felt surreal and perfect all at once. "What?" Olivia had asked, noticing his expression. "Nothing, just, this is nice." "Yeah," she'd agreed softly, "it really is." But the adjustment hadn't been entirely smooth. Small conflicts had emerged, the inevitable friction of two people learning to share space. Olivia had a habit of leaving cabinet doors open, which drove Daniel crazy. He had a tendency to rearrange things in the kitchen without telling her, so she could never find anything. She liked the house warm. He preferred it cooler. He wanted the TV on for background noise. She found it distracting. They'd had their first real fight 2 weeks after she'd moved in, over something completely stupid. Daniel had thrown away a jar of pasta sauce that had been in the fridge for a week, and Olivia had snapped at him about it. "I was saving that. It was opened a week ago. It was going bad. It was fine. Now I have to go to the store again because I was planning to use that for dinner." "I'll go to the store. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal. You can't just throw away my things without asking." Daniel had been taken aback by her vehemence. It's pasta sauce, Olivia, not a family heirloom. That's not the point. The point is you made a decision about something that was mine without consulting me. How would you feel if I started throwing away your stuff? I'd think you were helping clean out the fridge. Well, I don't. I think it's controlling. The word had hung between them, sharp and accusatory. Daniel had felt himself getting defensive. Controlling? I threw away old food. That's not controlling, that's basic kitchen hygiene. It's the principle of the thing. You didn't ask, you just assumed. They'd stood there in the kitchen, both breathing hard, and Daniel had realized this wasn't really about pasta sauce. This was about autonomy and space and the fear of losing yourself in a relationship. You're right, he'd said finally. I should have asked. I'm sorry. Olivia had deflated slightly. I'm overreacting. No, you're not. Or maybe you are, but I get why. You're worried about losing your independence, about me making decisions for you. She'd sighed, leaning against the counter. My ex used to do that. Make decisions about my life without consulting me. What we'd have for dinner, what we'd do on weekends, who we'd spend time with. I didn't even realize how controlling it was until after we broke up, and I swore I'd never let anyone do that to me again. I'm not him. I know, but old fears don't just disappear because you rationally know they're unfounded. Daniel had crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. Then we make a deal. I don't throw away anything of yours without asking first, even if I think it's obviously trash. And you tell me when I'm doing something that feels controlling instead of letting it build up until we're fighting about pasta sauce. Deal. She'd pressed her face against his chest. I'm sorry I yelled. I'm sorry I threw away your sauce. It probably was going bad. Probably, but that's not the point. They'd laughed, the tension breaking, and ordered pizza for dinner instead. And later, lying in bed, Olivia had said, We're going to have more fights. I know. Real ones, about real things, not just pasta sauce. I know that too. But we'll work through them, right? Like we did today. That's the plan. She'd been quiet for a moment. My parents used to fight all the time before my mom got sick, screaming matches that would last for hours. I used to hide in my room with headphones on, waiting for it to end, and I swore I'd never have a relationship like that. This isn't like that. We had a disagreement. We talked it through. We resolved it. That's healthy. Promise me something? Anything. Promise me we'll never go to bed angry, that no matter how upset we are, we'll at least talk before we sleep. I promise. And promise me you will tell me if I'm being unreasonable or if my past is making me overreact to normal things. I promise that too. As long as you promise to tell me when I'm being controlling or oblivious. Deal. They'd sealed it with a kiss, and Daniel had marveled at how even their fights brought them closer instead of pushing them apart. It was different from his marriage to Ashley, where every conflict had felt like another nail in the coffin of their relationship. With Olivia, conflicts felt like opportunities to understand each other better, to build stronger foundations. By the end of January, the house had fully transformed into their home. Olivia's paintings hung on the walls, her books filled the shelves, her coffee mug sat next to Daniel's in the cabinet. She'd planted bulbs in the front garden that would bloom in spring, marking the space as hers. Mason had adjusted beautifully, treating Olivia's permanent presence as the most natural thing in the world. He'd started calling her Liv sometimes, a casual nickname that made her eyes water the first time he'd used it. He'd bring her dandelions from the yard and drawings from school. He'd curl up next to her while she painted, working on his own art projects in comfortable silence. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel had found them in her studio, both intent on their respective canvases. Mason had been attempting a landscape, trees and mountains and a bright blue sky, while Olivia had been working on an abstract piece in shades of blue and gray. What are you painting? Daniel had asked her. The ocean, or my feelings about the ocean. I'm not entirely sure yet. For our trip? Maybe. Or just because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. About how it's constantly moving but always the same. Chaotic, but predictable. Deep thoughts from the art teacher. That's what art is for. Processing deep thoughts so you don't have to talk about them. Mason had held up his painting. Look what I made, Dad. That's beautiful, buddy. Very professional. Liv taught me about perspective. See how the mountains get smaller in the back? That's because they're far away. Very impressive. They'd spent the rest of the afternoon in the studio, all three of them creating, and Daniel had grabbed his new sketchbook and started drawing for the first time in over a decade. His hands had been rusty, his lines uncertain, but it had felt good to create something just for the joy of it. "What are you drawing?" Mason had asked, peering over. "The house. Our house. It looks just like it, except better. You're really good, Dad." "Thanks, buddy." Olivia had glanced over and smiled. "You are really good. You should do this more often." "Maybe I will." And he had. Over the following weeks, Daniel had started sketching regularly. The view from their porch, Mason playing in the yard, Olivia reading in her chair, small moments captured in pencil and paper, a visual diary of their life together. February brought Valentine's Day, and a rare night without Mason, who'd been invited to another sleepover. Daniel had made reservations at the nicest restaurant in town, but Olivia had convinced him to cancel them. "Let's stay in," she'd said. "Cook together, have wine, be comfortable. I don't need fancy restaurants." "You sure?" "Positive. I'd rather have you all to myself without having to share you with a crowded restaurant." So they'd cook together, making pasta from scratch, and laughing when the dough had gotten everywhere. They'd eaten by candlelight, talked for hours, and ended up making love on the living room floor because they could, because Mason wasn't home and they had the freedom to be spontaneous. Afterward, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, Olivia had said, "This is the best Valentine's Day I've ever had." Even though we didn't leave the house? Especially because we didn't leave the house. This is what I wanted, just us, being ourselves, no performance or pretense. "I love you," Daniel had said, the words coming easier each time he spoke them. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." Good scared or bad scared? The best kind. Winter had slowly given way to early spring. The bulbs Olivia had planted had started pushing through the soil. The days had grown longer, the temperatures milder, and the life they'd built together had started to feel less like a new beginning and more like something permanent and real. The house on Maple Crest Drive, which had once been just Daniel's haven, had become a home for all three of them. And the future, which had once felt uncertain and frightening, now felt full of possibilities neither Daniel nor Olivia had dared to imagine alone. Spring arrived in earnest by mid-March, transforming the neighborhood with color and warmth. The bulbs Olivia had planted months earlier burst into bloom, crocuses and daffodils and tulips creating a riot of purples, yellows, and reds along the front walk. Mason spent hours outside, rediscovering the yard after the long winter, his energy seemingly boundless now that he could run and play without bundling up in layers. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, the three of them moving through their days with the practiced ease of people who belonged together. Mornings meant coffee and breakfast chaos, Mason talking a mile a minute about whatever had captured his imagination while Daniel made lunches and Olivia braided her hair. Afternoons brought homework and art projects and the occasional emergency handyman call that Daniel couldn't refuse. Evenings were dinner together, always, a sacred tradition they'd established without ever formally discussing it. But beneath the comfortable surface, Daniel had been carrying a question that grew heavier with each passing day. It had started as a whisper in the back of his mind sometime in February and had grown into something he couldn't ignore. The question wasn't whether he wanted to marry Olivia. He'd known that with certainty for weeks now. The question was when and how, and whether she was ready for that kind of commitment. They'd only been living together for 2 months. By conventional standards, it was too soon. But nothing about their relationship had followed conventional timelines. They'd fallen in love quickly, moved in together faster than most would recommend, and built a family before they'd even had a chance to just be a couple. Still, Daniel knew what he wanted, and one evening in late March, after putting Mason to bed, he'd called Harper. "This is a surprise," she'd said when she answered. "You never call me. I need advice." "This should be good. What's up?" Daniel had taken a breath, suddenly nervous. "I want to propose to Olivia." There'd been a pause, then Harper had squealed so loudly Daniel had to pull the phone away from his ear. "Oh my God, Daniel, that's amazing." "Quiet down, you'll wake Mason." Sorry. I'm just so happy for you. When are you going to do it?" "That's why I'm calling." I don't know. Is it too soon? We've only been together since November." "Who cares about timelines? You know what you want. She knows what she wants. That's all that matters. But what if she says no? What if she thinks it's too fast? Then she'll tell you that and you'll wait. But Daniel, from everything you've told me about her, I don't think she's going to say no. I think she's just as invested in this as you are. I hope you're right. I'm always right. You should know that by now. Harper's voice had softened. Seriously, though, you sound happy, happier than I've heard you in years. Don't second-guess something good just because it's happening quickly. I'm terrified. Of course you are. That's how you know it matters. They talked for another hour, Harper helping him think through the logistics. He'd need a ring, a plan, the right moment. He'd need to talk to Mason first, make sure his son was on board. He'd need to be prepared for any answer, even if it wasn't the one he wanted. The next day, during Mason's school hours, Daniel had driven to the jewelry store in Boise. He'd felt ridiculous and nervous, completely out of his element as he'd looked at case after case of diamond rings that all looked the same to his untrained eye. "Can I help you find something?" the saleswoman had asked, her smile professional and kind. "I need an engagement ring, but I have no idea what I'm looking for." "Tell me about your girlfriend. What's she like?" Daniel had described Olivia, her love of art, her understated elegance, her preference for meaning over flash. The saleswoman had nodded thoughtfully and guided him to a different case, pulling out a ring with a simple platinum band and a modest round diamond, flanked by two smaller stones. "This might be right," she'd said. "It's classic but not ostentatious. The side stones are sapphires, which represent loyalty and wisdom. Something about it feels artistic without being overly ornate." Daniel had held the ring, imagining it on Olivia's finger, and something had clicked. "This is perfect." "You're sure? You don't want to look at others?" "I'm sure." The purchase had been easier than he'd expected, though the price had made him wince. He'd been saving for years, building a cushion for emergencies, but this felt like the right way to use those funds. He'd walked out with a small velvet box in his pocket, and his heart racing with possibilities. That evening, he'd asked Olivia if she could take Mason to the park for an hour. She'd looked at him curiously, but had agreed, and once they'd left, Daniel had paced the house trying to figure out how to have this conversation with his 7-year-old son. When they'd returned, Daniel had asked Mason to sit with him on the couch. "Am I in trouble?" Mason had asked immediately, his default assumption whenever serious conversations were initiated. "No, buddy. I just need to talk to you about something important." Mason had settled in, his small face serious. "Okay. You know how much Liv means to us, right? How she's become part of our family." "Yeah, I love Liv. I love her too, very much. And I want to ask her to marry me, to officially be part of our family forever." Mason's eyes had gone wide. "Like really married with a wedding and everything?" "Exactly like that. But I wanted to make sure you were okay with it first, because this affects you too. If Liv and I get married, she'll be your stepmom, officially." "Will I have to call her mom?" "Only if you want to. You can keep calling her Liv, or you can call her mom, or you can call her something else entirely, whatever feels right to you." Mason had thought about this, his young face scrunched in concentration. "I think I'd like to call her mom, but only sometimes, like when it feels right." Daniel's throat had tightened. "That sounds perfect. When are you going to ask her?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm trying to figure out the right moment." "You should do it somewhere special, like in a movie. Maybe at the park with flowers and music. Maybe. Or maybe somewhere that means something to just us." "Like the kitchen?" "You guys are always in the kitchen together." Daniel had laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Not quite what I was thinking, but you're not wrong. So you're really okay with this? With me marrying Liv?" "Dad, I wanted her to move in forever ago. Of course I'm okay with you marrying her. She makes you happy, and she makes really good cookies." "Those are both excellent reasons. Can I help pick out her ring?" "I already got the ring." "But you can help me figure out how to ask her." They'd spent the next hour brainstorming, Mason's ideas ranging from the sweet to the absurd. By the time Olivia had returned from her impromptu trip to the grocery store, Daniel and Mason had been huddled together on the couch, looking suspicious. "What are you two plotting?" she'd asked, setting down bags. "Nothing," they'd said in unison, which had only made her more suspicious. "Uh-huh," Well, whatever it is, I brought ice cream for after dinner, so maybe that'll convince you to confess. She'd disappeared into the kitchen, and Daniel had caught Mason's eye. His son had grinned and mimed, zipping his lips. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel had carried the ring with him constantly, waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. He'd considered grand gestures, fancy dinners, romantic getaways, elaborate surprises, but none of them felt right. Olivia wasn't someone who wanted public displays or over-the-top romance. She valued intimacy and meaning over spectacle. The moment finally came on a Tuesday evening in early April, unexpected and perfect in its ordinariness. They'd been in the backyard, all three of them, working in the garden. Olivia had been teaching Mason how to plant tomato seedlings, while Daniel had been fixing the fence that had been damaged in a late-season storm. The evening had been warm, the air filled with the scent of fresh earth and growing things. Mason had been covered in dirt and completely happy, chattering about how many tomatoes they'd have by summer. "We'll have so many we won't know what to do with them all," Olivia had been saying, her hands gentle as she'd shown Mason how to firm the soil around each plant. "We could make sauce, Dad. Dad makes really good sauce. We absolutely could. We could can it and have homemade sauce all winter." Daniel had paused in his work, watching them together. Olivia's patient instruction, Mason's eager absorption of knowledge, the easy affection between them. The setting sun had painted everything in gold, and something about the scene had felt complete, like this was exactly where they were all meant to be. He'd walked over, dirt on his hands, and the ring box suddenly heavy in his pocket. "Hey, Mason, can you go inside and wash up? It's almost dinner time." "But we're not done planting." "Liv and I will finish. You go ahead." Mason had run inside, and Olivia had looked up at Daniel with a smile. "What's up?" "I need to ask you something." "Okay." She'd stood, brushing dirt off her jeans, and Daniel had taken her hands. "Remember when you first moved in next door? You were so determined to do everything yourself. You wouldn't accept help with anything." "I was protecting myself." "I know. And then slowly, over time, you let me in. Let us in. And you became part of our lives in a way I never expected, but can't imagine living without." Olivia's expression had shifted, becoming more alert. "Daniel, what are you—" "Let me finish." He'd taken a breath, his hands trembling slightly. "You make me want to be braver, to take risks I'd normally run from, to believe that love doesn't have to be complicated or destructive. You're the best partner I've ever had, the best bonus mom Mason could ask for, and the person I want to spend the rest of my life with." He'd released her hands and pulled out the ring box, dropping to one knee in the garden dirt. "Olivia Turner, will you marry me?" Her hands had flown to her mouth, eyes wide and already filling with tears. "Daniel, I know it's fast. I know we've only been together a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you. Mason loves you. We want you to be ours, officially and forever. You really want to marry me? More than I've wanted anything in my entire life." She dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her dirty hands. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Relief had flooded through him so intensely he'd almost laughed. "Yeah? Did you really think I'd say anything else?" She'd kissed him, messy and emotional and perfect. "I love you so much, both of you. This family we've built. It's everything I never knew I needed." Daniel had pulled back enough to slide the ring onto her finger, and it had fit perfectly, catching the evening light. Olivia had stared at it, fresh tears streaming down her face. "It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you." "That's so cheesy. You love it." "I really do." They'd kissed again, kneeling in the garden dirt with tomato plants surrounding them, and Daniel had thought about how far they'd both come. Two guarded people who'd learned to tear down their walls, to risk vulnerability, to build something real and lasting. The back door had slammed, and Mason had come running out. Did she say yes? Did she say yes? She said yes! Daniel had called back, and Mason had launched himself at both of them, wrapping his arms around their necks. "I knew she would. I told Dad you would." Olivia had pulled back to look at Mason, wiping her eyes. "You knew about this?" "Dad asked me if it was okay, and I said yes because you're the best, and I want you to be my real mom." Oh, sweetie. She'd pulled him into a fierce hug. I already am your real mom, in all the ways that matter. The wedding will just make it official. They'd stayed like that in the backyard until the sun had set completely, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. They decided on a small wedding, just close friends and family. Summer, maybe, or early fall when the weather was perfect. Nothing elaborate, just meaningful. That night, after Mason had finally fallen asleep, still talking excitedly about the wedding, Daniel and Olivia had lain in bed, Olivia's left hand resting on Daniel's chest so they could both see the ring catching the moonlight from the window. I can't believe this is real, she'd whispered. Believe it. A year ago, I was alone in my house next door, convinced I'd never let anyone close again. And now I'm engaged to you, living in your house, helping raise your son. Life is strange. The best kind of strange. She'd been quiet for a moment, then said, I need to tell you something. Daniel's heart had skipped. That sounds ominous. It's not bad, just important. My dad called yesterday. He wanted to know if I'd come to his wedding next month. And? I told him I'd think about it, but I also told him about you, about us, about how I was happy here and building a life I actually wanted instead of running from one I didn't. How did he take it? Better than expected, actually. He sounded proud, maybe, or relieved, like maybe he'd been worried about me being alone. She'd turned to face Daniel. I think I want to go to his wedding, and I want you and Mason to come with me. I want him to meet the family I've chosen. Are you sure? I'm sure. I spent so long being angry at him for moving on, for selling our house, for building a new life. But I've done the same thing, haven't I? I've moved on, built something new. Maybe it's time to let go of that anger and just be okay with the fact that we're both trying to be happy in our own ways. That sounds very mature and well-adjusted. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not. You've always been mature and well-adjusted. You just needed to believe it yourself. They'd made plans to fly to Portland in May, all three of them, for a long weekend. It would be Mason's first time on a plane, which excited him almost as much as the wedding. It would be Daniel's first time meeting Olivia's father, which terrified him more than he wanted to admit. The weeks leading up to the trip passed quickly, filled with wedding planning discussions and Mason's end-of-school activities. They'd set a date for their own wedding, the first Saturday in September, in the backyard where Daniel had proposed, surrounded by the garden they'd planted together. Olivia had sold her house to a young couple just starting out, and the closing had been bittersweet. She'd cried a little, saying goodbye to the space that had been her refuge, but she'd also smiled, knowing that chapter was truly closed. No more keeping one foot out the door, she'd said to Daniel the night after the closing. I'm all in now. This is my home. You're my home. The trip to Portland arrived with unseasonably warm weather. Mason had been beside himself with excitement on the plane, pressing his face to the window and narrating everything he saw. Olivia had been quieter, nervous energy radiating from her as they'd gotten closer to her hometown. Her father, Robert, had met them at the airport, a tall, thin man in his 60s with graying hair and the same hazel eyes as his daughter. He'd hugged Olivia stiffly, the embrace of people who loved each other but didn't quite know how to show it. You look well, he'd said. Thanks, Dad. You too. She'd turned to Daniel and Mason. This is Daniel, and this is Mason. Robert had shaken Daniel's hand, his grip firm. I've heard a lot about you. All good things, I hope. Mostly. But there'd been a small smile, taking the edge off the words. Mason had charmed him immediately, asking a million questions about Portland and planes and whether they'd see the ocean. By the time they'd reached Robert's house, a modern condo downtown, nothing like the family home Olivia had grown up in, Mason had been chattering away like they'd known each other for years. The weekend had been surprisingly pleasant. Robert's fiancée, Linda, was a warm woman in her late 50s who worked as a nurse and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Olivia. The wedding itself had been small and elegant, held in a garden venue with close friends and family. Watching Robert and Linda exchange vows, Daniel had glanced at Olivia and found her crying quietly. He'd taken her hand, and she'd squeezed it tightly. I'm happy for him, she'd whispered. I didn't think I would be, but I am. That's growth. That's therapy and time and having my own happiness to focus on. After the ceremony, Robert had pulled Olivia aside for a private conversation. Daniel had watched from a distance, ready to intervene if needed, but their body language had been open, honest. When Olivia had returned, her eyes had been red, but her expression peaceful. "What did he say?" Daniel had asked. "He apologized for not being there after Mom died, for making me feel like I had to be so independent that I couldn't ask for help. He said he was proud of the woman I'd become, but he was sorry he hadn't been a better father in the process." That must have been hard to hear. It was, but it was also what I needed. I've spent so long being angry at him that I forgot he was grieving too. We both made mistakes. We both could have done better, but we're trying now, and that's what matters. On their last evening in Portland, they'd driven to the house Olivia had grown up in. The new owners had repainted it, changed the landscaping, made it their own, but the bones of it were the same. The porch where Olivia had sat with her mother, the oak tree in the yard where she'd built forts as a child. "How does it feel?" Daniel had asked, standing with her on the sidewalk while Mason played in a nearby park. "Sad, but also okay, like I'm saying goodbye to something I've already let go of." She'd leaned against him. "My home isn't here anymore. It's with you and Mason, in that house on Maple Crest Drive. That's where my life is now." They'd flown back to Idaho the next day, and Mason had talked nonstop about the trip. The plane, the wedding, meeting Grandpa Robert and Linda, seeing the ocean. Olivia had been quieter, processing, but there'd been a lightness to her that hadn't been there before. Summer arrived with long days and warm nights. They'd planted the garden in earnest, tomatoes and peppers and zucchini and herbs, and watched it grow with the same attention they gave to everything else in their life together. Mason had finished second grade with flying colors and had started summer camp, coming home each day with stories of adventures and new friends. July brought the Hawaii trip, and Daniel had stood in the airport watching Mason board a plane with Ashley and her husband, his heart in his throat. Olivia had stood beside him, her hand in his, and had said quietly, "He'll be fine. I know. You don't have to pretend you're not worried. I'm terrified. That's because you're a good dad. But he'll be fine, and we'll be here when he gets back." The 2 weeks without Mason had been strange. The house too quiet, their routines disrupted. But they'd taken their trip to the Oregon coast, renting a small cabin near Cannon Beach, and had spent their days hiking through forests and walking along the shore, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, sitting on the beach watching the sunset, Olivia had said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "After we get married, I'd like to adopt Mason. Legally, if that's something you'd both be okay with." Daniel had turned to look at her, surprised. "Really? He's already my son in every way that matters, but I'd like it to be official. I want him to know that I'm choosing him, permanently, the same way I'm choosing you." "We'd have to talk to Ashley." "I know. And if she says no, that's okay, but I want to at least ask. I want Mason to know that my commitment to him isn't contingent on my relationship with you. He's mine now, and I want that to be legally recognized." Daniel had kissed her, tasting salt air and feeling overwhelming gratitude for this woman who loved his son as fiercely as she loved him. "Let's talk to him when he gets back. If he wants it, we'll make it happen." Mason had returned from Hawaii tanned and full of stories, bearing gifts of shell necklaces and chocolate-covered macadamia nuts. He'd hugged them both tightly and said he'd missed them, but the trip had been amazing. A few days later, they'd sat down together and asked Mason about the adoption. His response had been immediate and enthusiastic. "Yes! Then Liv would really be my mom, like legally and everything." "You'd have two moms," Daniel had explained. "Ashley would still be your mom too." "I know, but Liv is the one who's here, who helps with homework and makes dinner and tucks me in. She should be my real mom too." They'd called Ashley together, and the conversation had been surprisingly easy. She'd agreed to the adoption without hesitation, saying she thought it was wonderful that Mason had someone who loved him so completely. "He deserves stability," Ashley had said, "and it sounds like you've given him that, all of you together." It had been the most civil conversation Daniel had ever had with his ex-wife, and he'd hung up feeling like maybe they'd all finally made peace with how things had turned out. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color. The wedding was scheduled for the first Saturday of the month, and the backyard had been transformed with white chairs and strings of lights and flowers from their own garden. The guest list was small: Harper, a few of Daniel's friends from town, Olivia's teacher colleagues, Robert and Linda, and Mason's grandparents who'd flown in from Florida. Intimate and perfect. The night before the wedding, Daniel had lain in bed unable to sleep, his mind racing with everything that was about to change and everything that already had. Olivia had been staying at Harper's for the night, something about bad luck and tradition, and the house had felt empty without her. Mason had appeared in his doorway around midnight. "Dad, you awake?" "Yeah, buddy. Can't sleep?" "Me neither. I'm too excited." Mason had climbed into bed beside him, and they'd lain there in the darkness talking about tomorrow, about what it would mean, about how their family was about to grow in ways they'd never imagined a year ago. "Are you happy, Dad?" "The happiest I've ever been." "Me too. I love our family." "I love our family too." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the sky an endless blue. Daniel had gotten ready with Mason's help, his son taking his role as best man very seriously, making sure Daniel's tie was straight and his shoes were shined. The ceremony had been brief and beautiful. Olivia had walked down the aisle to acoustic guitar, wearing a simple white dress and carrying wildflowers from the garden. She'd been crying before she'd even reached him, and Daniel had been crying too, not caring who saw. They'd exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises to love and honor, to communicate and forgive, to build a life based on honesty and trust. Daniel had promised to always make her laugh and never throw away her pasta sauce. Olivia had promised to always sing off-key in the shower and never stop seeing the best in him. When the officiant had pronounced them husband and wife, they'd kissed to applause and cheers, and Mason had jumped up and down yelling, "They did it! They're married!" The reception had been casual and joyful, barbecue and dancing and toasts that had made everyone laugh and cry. Harper had given a speech about how she'd known from the moment she'd met Olivia that Daniel had found his person. Robert had spoken about second chances and the courage it takes to build new families, and Mason, with help from Daniel, had given his own toast. "I'm really glad Dad married Liv," he'd said into the microphone, his young voice clear, "because now we're a real family. And Liv makes the best cookies, and she's really nice, and she helps me with my art, and she loves us a lot. So thank you, Liv, for being my bonus mom. I love you." There hadn't been a dry eye in the backyard. As the sun had set and the dancing had begun, Daniel had pulled Olivia close, swaying to music under the string lights they'd hung together. "Happy?" he'd asked. "Beyond words." "Any regrets?" "Not a single one. You?" "Just that I didn't do this sooner." She'd laughed, the sound full of joy. "We did it exactly when we were ready, not a moment before." They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by people they loved, building memories they'd carry forever. And when the night had finally ended and the guests had departed, the three of them had sat in the backyard together, Daniel and Olivia and Mason, looking at the mess of plates and decorations and feeling nothing but contentment. "We should clean this up," Olivia had said, but she'd made no move to stand. "Tomorrow," Daniel had countered. "Tonight we just sit here and appreciate what we've built." "Our family," Mason had added, leaning against Olivia's side. "Our family," she'd agreed, pressing a kiss to his head. Time passed in the way it does when life is full and happy, quickly but richly. Fall gave way to winter, winter to spring. The adoption had been finalized in November, and Mason had a new birth certificate listing Olivia as his mother. He'd framed it and hung it in his room with pride. They'd celebrated their first anniversary the following September with a return trip to the coast, leaving Mason with his grandparents. They'd walked the same beaches, stayed in the same cabin, and marveled at how much had changed in a single year. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Olivia had admitted one evening, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and pink. "For something to go wrong or for this happiness to fade. What if it doesn't? What if this is just our life now? Then I'm the luckiest person alive. We both are." Years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Mason grew from a 7-year-old boy into a teenager with opinions and mood swings and his mother's artistic talent. He'd started calling Olivia Mom without qualification, saving Ashley for the woman who visited twice a year and sent birthday cards. Daniel's handyman business had grown, eventually becoming successful enough that he'd hired help and could be more selective about jobs. Olivia had been promoted to head of the art department at her school, implementing programs that brought creativity to hundreds of children. They'd added a dog to their family, a rescue mutt named Sketch, that Mason had fallen in love with at the shelter. They'd taken family vacations, weathered illnesses and arguments, celebrated birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays that felt special simply because they were together. And through it all, the foundation they'd built that first year, trust and communication, and the willingness to be vulnerable, had held strong. On a winter evening 5 years after their wedding, Daniel found himself standing in the backyard where he'd proposed, where they'd gotten married, where they'd built a life from careful hope and brave choices. Snow was falling softly, coating everything in white, and through the kitchen window he could see Olivia helping Mason with his geometry homework while Sketch slept at their feet. It was an ordinary moment, nothing dramatic or newsworthy. Just his family, together, in the house they'd made a home. Harper's words from years ago came back to him. Don't second-guess something good just because it's happening quickly. He'd been terrified then, standing on the edge of forever with a woman he'd known for months but felt like he'd loved for lifetimes. Now, watching through the window as Olivia laughed at something Mason said, he understood that fear and love weren't opposites. They were partners, two sides of the same coin. You couldn't have one without risking the other. The question wasn't whether to be afraid, but whether the love was worth the fear, and every single day the answer was yes. The door opened behind him and Olivia stepped out, wrapping a coat around herself. What are you doing out here? It's freezing. Just thinking. About what? Daniel pulled her close, breathing in her familiar scent. About how a year ago I was a single dad who thought his life was complete, who thought love was too risky, too complicated, too dangerous for someone with a kid to protect. And now? Now I know I was protecting myself, not Mason. I was using him as an excuse to avoid vulnerability because I'd been hurt before and was scared of being hurt again. What changed? You changed, or maybe I changed, or maybe we changed each other. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I'm grateful for it. For you. For all of this. Even when I leave cabinet doors open? Even then. Even when we fight about stupid things? Especially then. Because fighting means caring enough to work through things instead of walking away. She tilted her face up to kiss him, soft and sweet, snowflakes catching in her hair. I love you, Daniel Hayes, today and every day. I love you too, Olivia Hayes, forever. They stood there in the falling snow, two people who'd learned that the bravest thing you could do wasn't protecting yourself from pain, it was opening yourself to joy despite the risk. That real love wasn't about perfect moments or grand gestures, but about showing up consistently, communicating honestly, and choosing each other every single day. A kiss from an old friend had changed everything, had revealed feelings Daniel had been too afraid to acknowledge. But it was Olivia's kiss, her willingness to be vulnerable, to take a chance, to build something beautiful from broken pieces, that had transformed his life completely. In a quiet neighborhood where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen, where routines were sacred and lives were carefully ordered, two guarded hearts had found each other and decided to be brave. And in that bravery, they discovered something neither had dared to believe possible. That home wasn't a place you protected, but a family you built, one honest moment at a time, with love that grew stronger, not despite the fear, but because of it. The single father who'd once thought his world was small had learned the truth. Love didn't make your world smaller. It made everything infinitely bigger, brighter, and more beautiful than you'd ever imagined possible. And that was the greatest gift of all.